Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. My name is Councillor Jim Park and I chair this committee. The Local Government Act 2020 enables Council to hold virtual meetings with councillors participating remotely by means of electronic communication. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed on the Council website to enable public viewing of the proceedings, including councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council website soon after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered by the committee, then the meeting will be adjourned until resolution. However, Council is not responsible for any technical difficulties that may be experienced by a member of the community in participating remotely in this meeting. Once the meeting commences, only limited assistance can be provided. I acknowledge that all councillors are present and on screen for tonight's meeting. There are also a number of officers in attendance tonight who will be introduced when presenting their reports. The purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. The committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the reports, which include a summary of the objections received. Tonight we will be facilitating public submissions by electronic means of communication to hear from members of the community or applicants. I will call on you individually when it's time to make your submission, and you'll be placed into the meeting to present your submission. When making your submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the officer's recommendation. Please do not repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep your submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. Importantly, focus on your concerns rather than on matters of history or detail in the officer's report. If you are opposed to the planning application, please tell the committee why and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. There is a strict time limit of 3 minutes for each submitter. Whilst as chairperson I reserve the right to vary that time, I seldom do. At the 2.5 minute mark, I will announce that you have 30 seconds remaining to conclude. Moving now to the order of business. Apologies. Ms Ritchie, are there any apologies?
Through you, Chair, there are no apologies for tonight's meeting.
Thank you. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on 20 September 2021. Councillor Galt and seconded by Councillor Sinfield. Is there any discussion? And I put that motion. Those in favour? Those against? That's carried unanimously. Item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any declarations? No. That takes us then to item 3.1, Heritage Assessment 57 and 60 Berkeley Street, Hawthorn, and that report will be presented by Ms Amanda Seymour, Senior Strategic Planner.
Thank you, Chair. Tonight, officers are seeking the Urban Planning Delegated Committee's adoption of the heritage citations for 57 and 60 Berkeley Street, Hawthorn, and a resolution to proceed with a planning scheme amendment to include the properties in a heritage overlay on a permanent basis. In response to community requests, the heritage significance of the two houses was re-investigated by Council. Following reassessment, both properties were recommended for inclusion in the heritage overlay. Preliminary consultation on the draft heritage citations was undertaken from the 4th of May to the 4th of June 2021. 57 submissions were received, including 3 objecting submissions and 54 supporting submissions. The objections to the inclusion of 57 Berkeley Street in the heritage overlay focused on Council's ongoing investigations into the heritage significance of the property. The property has been assessed by 4 different heritage consultants over the past 20+ years. The heritage assessments undertaken in 2006, 2017 and 2019 concluded that the property did not meet the threshold for inclusion in the heritage overlay. Despite these recommendations, a 4th heritage assessment was undertaken in 2020 in response to continued community pressure to protect the property. The 2020 Heritage Assessment concluded that 57 Berkeley Street is of individual heritage significance and should be included in the heritage overlay. The objecting submission from the owners of 60 Berkeley Street questioned the merits of the heritage assessment due to the large double-storey addition at the rear of the property. Despite the objections received, Council's heritage consultants continue to believe the properties are worthy of heritage protection and should be included in the heritage overlay. If the Urban Planning Delegated Committee decides to adopt the heritage citations and proceed with the planning scheme amendment to include the properties in a heritage overlay, officers will commence the formal planning scheme amendment process. There will be further opportunities for residents and the owners to make submissions to Council as part of the formal exhibition process. Council can also make refinements to the heritage citation if required during the planning scheme amendment process. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Seymour. 6 people have indicated they wish to make a submission on this matter. Once I have announced your name, a member of the governance team will enable access to the meeting so you may make your submission. If a submitter is not present when their name is called or a submitter experiences a technical issue, we'll move on to the next speaker. Once all speakers have made their submissions, we will again attempt to hear from any speaker who experienced technical issues. Please remember that there's a strict time limit of 3 minutes. We have a lot of speakers tonight, so there won't be any latitude on that 3 minutes. Also, it's very important that submitters remember not to repeat what earlier speakers have said. If we get to you and what you would have presented has already been said, then by all means let us know. The fact that you've indicated a wish to speak doesn't mean that you need to do so if someone else has covered off what you would like to submit. The first submitter will be Richard Tuckwell, followed by Antoinette Tuckwell. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. Mr. Tuckwell, if you could start your submission with your name and the suburb in which you reside, please.
Richard Tuckwell, I live in Hawthorn.
Thank you.
Okay. So, further to my letter, I wish to draw Councillors' attention to the context in which this decision about heritage overlay at 57 Berkeley Street is being made. This meeting comes at a time when property developers are on the march. They are well-funded and politically powerful, and they do not care about the beauty of Melbourne, much less its past or the preservation of its distinctness. All they care about is the profit they can plunder here and now. We see evidence of this all around us in Hawthorn, as with each passing year, more and more architectural gems are bulldozed out of existence with callous disregard, not only for their irreplaceability as individual buildings, but also for the streetscapes which they help to make up. A shocking recent example is the destruction of 120 Riversdale Road, a wonderful old house at the bottom of Berkeley Street that any sensible person would have protected, but which instead was flattened to make way for a hideous block of flats. Having said this, the threat to our neighbourhoods does not come from property developers alone. Sadly, there is also a contingent of would-be home builders who, for whatever reason, are as indifferent to beauty and tradition as the big developers are. We ought therefore not be surprised that the vulgarity on Riversdale Road is eclipsed by a single dwelling just around the corner. The house at number 19 Kooyonkoot Road, variously termed the Bathtub, the Whaling Station, or Darth Vader's Summer Home, is a monstrosity without compare. It squats on the land of what was one of the most beautiful homes in Hawthorn, amongst a row of houses that was one of Melbourne's most enchanting. Alas, without heritage overlay to protect the property, all of this went up in smoke in the blink of an eye to fulfill some careless person's selfish little dream. I mention these embarrassments because, to me, their harsh concrete lines are emblematic of the unadorned future that awaits us if we fail to defend our inheritance now. For the fact is that, if the committee does not make the right decision, we can rest assured that the legacy of a century will be tossed on the dust heap, just as wastefully as it was in those other cases. The context of tonight's meeting, then, is a slow but steady creep of needless and thoughtless destruction. Bearing in mind this context and what is at stake here more broadly, I would like to conclude my remarks by imploring the committee not to smack our ancestors and our descendants in the face by denying this bid, and incidentally, would remind councillors that Boroondara has been happy to protect the much less significant property at 54 Barclay Street. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions from councillors. There aren't, so thank you for your presentation. And that takes us to Antoinette Tuckwell, who will be followed by Charles Tuckwell.
Hello.
Good evening. If I could ask you to start with your name and the suburb in which you reside, please.
My name is Antoinette Tuckwell. Sorry, can you see me?
I can, yes.
Yes. My name is Antoinette Tuckwell and I reside in Canberra.
Thank you. And you can commence your presentation, thanks.
When I found out that my former family home was once again on the market last year, I burst into tears. This is because I know that any time 57 Barclay Street goes on the market, its destruction becomes a very real possibility. A thought which is soul-crushing to me. I lived in Barclay Street from birth, along with my 3 older brothers, and so my earliest childhood memories stem from living there. Be it pretending to be a princess in the front garden, annoying neighbours by shouting Marco and Polo when playing in the pool, or running around on the tennis court playing our sophisticated version of the game It. My dad's work meant that as I got older, our family moved to and from Australia several times. As we moved back and forth, 57 Barclay Street remained both my and the family's anchor to Melbourne. The house formed an intimate part of our family history, especially as it was the only one that all 6 of us lived in full time. When I was 20 years old, my parents ultimately decided to sell 57 Barclay Street, wanting to downsize. It was devastating news for me and my brothers, but we knew that our parents would try their best to sell it on to another family, so that our home would remain a home. On my last day of living in Barclay Street, I went around our home, both inside and out, filming and taking photos for hours, desperately trying to capture its essence before it fell into new hands. As the threat of destruction constantly looms over the house due to the lack of heritage protection, I'm concerned not only for myself, but for the community more broadly. Like many of the older, beautiful Melburnian properties, it stands in contrast to the soulless, modern monstrosities that we constantly see springing up. It is home with many years of history and many people's fond memories attached to it. If the state signs off on the bulldozing of 57 Barclay Street, which is, in effect, what it will be doing if it chooses not to protect it, it is more broadly consenting to an uprooting of the society. This is because uprooting such homes eliminates important traces of our society, of our history. We have seen enough destruction of beautiful Melbourne homes in recent years, with abominations springing up that destroy entire streetscapes. Please do the right thing and help curb this awful trend by defending 57 Barclay Street. Thank you.
Thank you. And we don't appear to have any questions, so thank you for your presentation. And that takes us then to Charles Tuckwell, who will be followed by Kel White. Good evening, Mr. Tuckwell.
Good evening. Can you see me?
No, we can. Yeah, we can now. So if I could ask you to start your presentation with your name and the suburb in which you reside, please.
My name is Charles Tuckwell and I reside in Hawthorne and in Canberra. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I speak tonight in support of 57 Barclay Street's heritage overlay inclusion. I won't bore the council by summarising the findings of Peter Andrew Barrett and Trethowan. Instead, I appeal to the council as someone with an intimate history and knowledge of the property. Indeed, I was fortunate enough to grow up at 57 Barclay Street. I lived there from birth till the age of 10 and again from the ages of 12 to 14. Even at a young age, the historical and aesthetic significance of the property was not lost on me, as it surely cannot be lost on others. As children, my mother would often tell me and my siblings that our house was Federation style. What that meant exactly, we did not know, but we didn't need to. A 5-minute walk around Scotch Hill is all one needs to know that the property is special and worth overlay protection. In recent years, its need for protection has grown. Since leaving Barclay Street, my family and I have sometimes returned to the area and noted all the beautiful properties that have been knocked down to make way for soulless, characterless abodes. These concrete and glass boxes don't need describing. You know what they look like. You've probably got one near your home too. Perhaps you live in one. They're the sorts of buildings in that unfortunate international style that make no attempt to improve the neighbourhood aesthetic and represent nothing and nobody. Unfortunately, the rise of the investment property economy makes these monstrosities increasingly common. Generous tax breaks and a decline in community strength means overzealous property developers invariably get their way, all while sticking the middle finger at their neighbours. These developers don't care about beauty or history, they care only about short-term gain. The fact that one's home helps set or ruin the neighbourhood aesthetic does not concern them. The moral obligation to act as a mere steward in preserving historically significant properties so that our grandchildren may one day enjoy their beauty is lost on them. These people have a one-track mind, and the destination is profit. Scotch Hill is at a turning point. So many properties that should have been protected are gone. Some, like 57 Barclay Street, remain. But without heritage overlay, they won't be around for long. So I plead with the council this evening to protect 57 Barclay Street and so many other beautiful properties around Melbourne like it, so that young boys and girls yet unborn may enjoy the properties my siblings and I once did. And if not for them, for the maintenance of one of Melbourne's most beautiful neighbourhoods. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. We don't appear to have any questions, so thank you for your presentation, and we'll move on to Mr. Twite, who will be followed by Neil Young. Mr. Twite, good evening.
Can you hear me, Councillor?
I can indeed, yes.
Great.
And
Thank
if I
you.
could ask you to commence your presentation with your name and the suburb in which you reside, please.
Thank you, Councillor Park. My name is Kel Twite. I'm a Director of SJB Planning, which are planning consultants here on behalf of the owners of both 57 and 60 Berkeley Street in Hawthorn. My office is located in South Bank.
Thank you.
Councillors, as summarised in the officer here report here before you, this process has come about, if you like, from council engaging context to prepare its heritage gap study in between 2016 and 2019. And at that point in time, the heritage gap study, undertaken by council's preferred consultants Context, did not find either buildings to be of significance. And in response to more community pressure, consultants were asked to think about it again. And they were asked to again review in detail number 57 Berkeley Street. And at that point, the consultants again found that it wasn't worthy of support. And the officer's report fairly outlines the background that relates to all of this. And so far as 57 Berkeley Street is concerned, it's been the subject of 5 separate heritage assessments over the journey, starting with the Hawthorn Heritage Study by Meredith Gould in '93. At that point, it gave it a C grading, and rightly no overlay was pursued. The C graded buildings were further reviewed in Hawthorn by Lovell Chen in 2016, revised in 2007, and again in 2009. The site was reviewed and deemed to be of insufficient significance to warrant heritage listing. That then led us to the heritage gap study that we've then talked about. So we've had a series of 5 heritage assessments. So at this point, 5 assessments by 3 consultants. From a procedural point of view, as outlined in the report, Council pursued a planning scheme amendment for 57 Berkeley Street, and the Minister for Planning refused that in May 2020. The Minister advised that applying a heritage overlay to an individually contributory place was contrary to the current heritage standards and procedures and not in accordance with the accepted standards for identifying heritage places. Now, since that time, nothing has shifted in either terms of the criteria against which such should be considered or the context of the site. We understood that at that time, Council was advised the Minister's decision was final and no further avenue for Council to appear and appeal the decision. Less than 3 months later, after receiving that advice from the Minister, a 5th heritage review was commissioned by Andrew Peter Barrett in August 2020. This review came to a different conclusion, perhaps surprisingly, from the past 4 independent consultant reviews conducted on behalf of the Council. So our client at number 57 finds themselves in the same position they were a little over a year ago, with again Council seeking to resolve to ask the Minister for controls, despite that the advice previously that the Minister's decision is final. I guess in summary, Council, our clients submit that Council is overreaching in its unrelenting pursuit for a heritage listing for these properties, which has come about from community interest in the face of advice from the majority of heritage specialists whose views are on the public record. The Minister for Planning's decision less than 16 months ago refused on an individual basis, and we submit that nothing has shifted in the intervening period. We accept that Council has a duty to appropriately apply its planning scheme, including the application of heritage overlays. We also submit that it has a duty to be fair and be fair to all parties. Accordingly, we submit that Council should abandon the investigation of the heritage listing at 57 Berkeley Street on the basis that it's just becoming unfair and unreasonable and contrary to the previous decision of the Minister. We also submit that the pursuit of the heritage listing for both properties is based on community pressure rather than the substantive heritage advice that Council has received over the journey and should be fairly abandoned. Thank you, councillors, for your time tonight.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions by councillors. There doesn't appear to be, so thank you for your presentation. And that takes us to Mr. Young, who'll be followed by our final presenter, Mark Kerr. Good evening, Mr. Young.
Good evening, councillor. Can you see me?
I can see you and hear you, so I'll just get you to commence with your name and the suburb in which you reside, please.
My name is Neil Young. I reside in Hawthorn. My property in Kooyonkoot Road backs on to 57 Berkeley Street, and I have lived in this area since 1996 and know it very well. I strongly support the recommendations for heritage protection for both properties. I'll focus most particularly on 57 Berkeley Street. I adopt the submissions from members of the Tuckwell family. Too many heritage properties in this area have been lost and replaced with monstrous developments. That has occurred because council has been too slow or too timid to act as it ought to have acted and as the community expects it to act. The loss here would be catastrophic for the community and would rob it of heritage places of great significance which are greatly valued. You can, I think, almost see that it's on the cards that this property, particularly 57 Berkeley Street, would be lost, it would be demolished, along with the properties that are now derelict at the corner of Calentina Road and Berkeley Street, which abut it. I will focus many of my submissions on the rather distorted and unbalanced account of previous reports given by Mr. Twite. I've addressed this in detail in writing. The fact is that the 1993 report rated 57 Berkeley Street as a property of heritage significance, visually conveying the historical character of the area, and that was quite accurate. It was followed by 2 very high-level desktop reports in 2006 to 2009 and then 2019 that did not carry out any visual inspections, but obviously did not know the area well, and there were no more than desktop studies of a multitude of properties. They did not focus on these 2 particular properties in question here. By contrast, the current reports before Council are thorough, careful and focused on these particular properties, and they benefit from visual inspections. They are to be accorded due weight and much greater weight than those intermediate submissions. Now, can I address the proposition that this has recently been examined by the Minister? That is a mistaken submission. The Minister was addressing the different question whether the heritage overlay should be extended to 57 Berkeley Street, assuming it was only classed as a property of contributory significance. I well remember the discussion in Council in 2020, in February, where a majority of councillors inquired whether it was open to Council to investigate reclassifying 57 Berkeley Street as a property of individual significance. So the Minister addressed a totally different question. That is no reason why Council should not proceed in the way that's been recommended. Now, as to the property at 57 Berkeley Street itself, it is the only example of a classic Federation villa south of Calentina on Scotch Hill, and there are only 2 such properties on Scotch Hill, the other at 22 Berkeley Street. But that is very distinct. It's quite different because it doesn't have the return verandas and bay windows oriented to look down the valley to Gardeners Creek, which bespeaks the historical significance of 57 Berkeley Street.
Mr. Young, I'll need you to start to wrap up, please.
Yes, one more observation. For anyone who's seen the property, the rear extension is barely noticeable from the street and does not detract from its heritage values. Thank you, Councillor, for the graciousness in letting me finish.
No problem. I'll just check if any councillors have any questions. No, thank you. So thank you for your presentation. And we'll move now to Mr. Kerr.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. If I could ask that you commence with your name and the suburb in which you reside, please.
My name is Mark Kerr and I live in Hawthorne. In fact, I live 50 metres up the road from 57 on the same side of the street.
And that's not you, clearly.
No, this is Colin. Colin is a cockatoo that arrives at the same time of day for the last 30 years to a local house. I also want to mention that Peg is a descendant of a family of magpies that have lived in Canterbury for the last 60 years at my mother's place. I want to show you a picture of a couple of lovebirds, which was taken only yesterday. These lovebirds, Judy and Kev as they're known, have frequented the same houses and trees in Berkeley Street and Kooyong Koot for as long as I have known. All these birds need habitat. They need amenity and they need space. I live 30 metres up the hill and I believe that the Federation Villa at number 37 is a significant large garden with a principal tree and an outstanding villa residence. I would describe it as a cracker. I also drive past the property and I think of the genius of Graham Tuckwell. It's great to see some of his children on the video. It should not be underestimated that his global role in developing a whole new class of investment asset called exchange traded funds. He started the first one in gold and there are now thousands of these products globally. They've been a saviour for investors globally. So the property has significance for Graham actually living in the residence. I believe that the trees and garden can't be replaced in the next 50 years. It can't be replaced by instant trees. The garden's taken over 100 years to get where it is. I'm no expert on home design, but I agree with the words of the current experts and council officers that support the outstanding merits of 57 Berkeley Street. Number 57 represents the last 100 years of grand living in Hawthorn. I just want to touch briefly on the last 20 years of development in Berkeley Street. It's been appalling. Let me tell you how they do it. First, they let the grass grow for 3 years. They keep the properties in poor condition. Second, they grate the entire block with a bulldozer, noting that nothing lives, nothing survives, no plants, no animals. Then massive box houses populate as much of the blocks as possible. Most, if not all, of the trees and feature gardens are all destroyed. There's one fine example in the street at the moment if you'd like to have a look. The fact is that most of these recent developments have mainly consisted of families leaving southern China and Hong Kong and surrounding countries to seek a better life. Of 6 of the last 8 sales in the street have been sold to such families. I strongly support their right to live here. However,
I have to start to wrap up. Thanks.
All right. I have no interest in these box houses being populated. I'd like to also note that the very strong petition, and I'd also like to point out to the council that if this gets demolished, the planning scheme will be in tatters and it'll be a slow death for your planning scheme. I'd also like to just in closing say that the Labor government is losing support. The government and VCAT need to be sent a message, and I'm looking forward to my councillors supporting the residents. I've never seen a better turnout en masse from residents to support such an application before you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, and I'll just see if there's any questions from councillors. There doesn't appear to be. So thank you for your presentation, and
thank you.
That takes us back to Ms. Seymour for any matters arising.
Thank you, Chair. There's probably just a few things that would be worth clarifying. The first is that the heritage overlay can only be applied in instances where there's heritage significance which has been established by a heritage consultant. It's not intended to be used as a development control to prevent development from occurring. The other probably key thing to address is some of the comments that were made by Kel Twite, in that he indicated that there was nothing new that came from the heritage assessment that wasn't previously known. That's not the case for 60 Berkeley Street. So with 60 Berkeley Street, the heritage assessment uncovered the architect of the property, and the architect of the property is one of the key reason why the property is now recommended for individual heritage protection. The property was designed by a notable architect who has other similar properties that are already included in the heritage overlay, and on that basis they believed that the property was of individual significance and should be included in the heritage overlay. The other thing that's probably just worth clarifying is the decision of the minister that came following the UPSC meeting back in February of 2020. So the minister considered the inclusion of 57 Berkeley Street in the heritage overlay on the notion that it was a contributory place. And the heritage assessment at that time, his decision didn't entertain the idea of the property being a significant place. Since that decision of the minister was made, another heritage assessment has been undertaken, and that has come to a different conclusion, that the property is of individual significance and should be included in the heritage overlay as an individual place. And I think they're the main things that we needed to address.
What did you make of Colin?
The bird?
The bird.
I thought he was very pretty.
What he was. All right, thank you. Let me just see if the councillors have any questions. Councillor Watson does.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is both specific and general all at the same time. So the specific question I have and general comment is around process. So the process here seems to have begun in 1993 and is now concluding in 2021. Just from a very simplistic view of this, it looks like to the layperson, if you keep pushing, you can get council to just generate heritage report after heritage report until you get an answer you like. And then when you get that, then you go to the minister. Could you please, I guess, give me more confidence in the system? Because if this is the brave new world that we've entered into with this property,
I'll stop you there because I think
I've got concerns.
I think your question's clear, and perhaps in addressing that question, you know, if there's been movement in anything around that explains it, I think it'd be worthwhile hearing that as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so I'll talk to 57 Berkeley Street because that's probably the one that's had the most interest and the most assessments undertaken for it. So 57 Berkeley Street is probably an example of a borderline heritage property. So often what will happen when a heritage assessment is undertaken, council will take it, you know, adopt the citation or go through a planning amendment process, and then we'll get to an independent planning panel and you'll have two heritage consultants that are arguing for and against a property's heritage protection. So normally the differing opinions of a heritage consultant are hashed out through the panel process. In this instance, we haven't got to that stage. So we are in a situation where we have two heritage consultants that have differing views on a heritage property's significance. It doesn't always happen that way. It typically only happens when the property is borderline. So sometimes there's a clear-cut case that it either is or it isn't a heritage place. Sometimes they kind of, you know, they sort of fall in the middle. And I think 57 Berkeley Street is one of those properties that sort of falls in the middle. So the heritage assessments that were done by Lovell Chen and Context prior to the last assessment, they undertook site inspections of the property and they did a detailed assessment, but they concluded that the property was not of individual significance when it was compared to other properties. They also gave greater weight to the alterations that have been made to the property. So the property has a large addition at the rear, which when you view from the street, most people probably wouldn't realise it's an addition because it's replicating the style of the original dwelling. But it also has the, I can't think of the word, but it basically doubles the size of the house. So from the street, it looks more substantial than it probably would have when it was originally assessed in 1993. So those two consultants deemed that that addition had impacted its heritage significance, and for that reason, it didn't meet the threshold. The assessment that was done in 2020 by Peter Barrett, it came to a different conclusion about the impact of that addition at the rear of the property. And he concluded that, you know, it was there, but the original house was still largely intact and therefore it had individual heritage significance. So I think, you know, you could view what's been happening with 57 Berkeley Street as, you know, council, you know, shopping around until it gets the outcome that it wants. But normally you don't get to this situation that either is heritage or it's not, where Berkeley Street is a bit more borderline, so it's a bit more grey. So I don't think you can get heritage consultants to tell you whatever you want them to. I think it really depends on the property and where it falls in terms of the spectrum of the heritage assessment. Some are more clear than others. Hopefully that answers that
Thank
question.
you. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, just a follow-up question, Chair, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you for that, the clarity on and what has happened. But the question I'd like you to address is why has it taken so long? It began in 1993, and I know you've said it's kind of grey, but in terms of people buying property and having a degree of certainty of what they can and can't do with it.
I'll stop you there. I think your question is why sort of
taken so long?
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure that I can answer why it wasn't protected back in 1993. I don't know whether Christian wants to add something.
I might just add, it's very tempting to see this as a continuing process from 1993 to now, but in reality, it's not a continuous process. We have to see them as individual decisions that are made at a given point in time based on the expert advice that exists at that moment or that is being given to council at that particular moment. So while it's tempting to see it as this process, and certainly as a property owner or a resident, you might see it that way because that's an easy way to understand it. That's not actually the way that the process works. So we have to look at it based on the evidence and the information and the expert advice that we receive on at any given time, that we make a decision or council makes a decision to go out and engage a heritage consultant to have an assessment undertaken on an individual property or a suburb or a smaller precinct. So it's not quite correct to see it as a continuum. Yes, for individual property owners, that may be frustrating because they've purchased a property, but the purchase of a property at any given time doesn't mean that the planning controls might not change at some point in the future. That's true for a heritage overlay, that's true for zoning, that's true for any other overlay that council might apply to the land to deal with any kind of planning and land use related matter. So here, I think the issue really is that, as councillors would be aware in recent years, the community interest in some properties in particular, and this is certainly one of those, has become so great that where officers have received continuing nominations and new information, where the community is so engaged in this process that they provide us with information that officers are really obliged to consider. And in order for us to consider that, as we are not the experts, we need the advice of a heritage consultant. We can't continue to go back to the same ones because that will generate a mistrust within the community. Well, those heritage consultants, in this case Context or Trethal, they're not going to change their opinion because they've already looked at it in the past. So we need kind of that independent review. And that's really what's happened here. I'd agree with Ms. Seymour's that this is one of those cases where there is a borderline call to be made. And certainly, I think the mixing up between number 60 and 57 Berkeley that is being attempted by Mr. Twite, they're completely separate. We're only talking about number 57 here. There is a borderline call, and the opinion that we have in front of us that is difficult for us to not act upon is the recommendation that the site is of individual significance, irrespective of what the other consultants previously might have said. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm happy to take any other question on that issue.
Yeah. Thanks
you, Chair. For that. All right, I'll move to Councillor Biggar.
Yeah, I'm just ready to move a motion when the time is right, please. I'd like to foreshadow that. I don't have any questions.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Then I'll take your motion, Councillor Biggar.
I'd like to move the officer's recommendation, please.
And a seconder for that, Councillor Sinfield. And to assist Councillor Biggar at this juncture, is there any opposition? It appears not. Councillor Watson?
Councillor Parker, I'm just, I believe that Councillor Stavrou is the ward councillor. Have I got my addresses
No,
mixed
it's
up?
Councillor Biggar.
Councillor Biggar? No, sorry, it's just a point of clarity. I was worried that the ward councillor might have been Councillor Stavrou and that he might like to speak. So I have no opposition to the motion.
Okay, Councillor Biggar, then I'll move to you. It appears that the motion's unopposed.
Thank you, Chair. Well, it is a real pleasure for me to be able to speak to this report tonight. And I firstly want to thank the officers for their hard work and their professionalism with this report. As you can see, it's been a long time coming over many years. And for me, these two homes, 57 and 60 Barclay Street, represent, I think, this rich history and the culture, the architectural beauty of Hawthorne. really the city's history holds enormous value to our community. It belongs to each one of us, and the built environment is really a key element of our sense of place. And for many, it's an association with an important part of who we are. And I think it's something we need to preserve. You know, we hear this time and time again from the community: protect our heritage, our history, our remarkable built form. Clearly, the journey particularly for 57 Barclay, has been long and has been complicated, and it's not finished yet. As a house, it is a beautiful example of a Federation-style villa with arts and crafts detailing. It's beautiful. We have a responsibility and a privilege, and I think a role in protecting homes that mean a lot to the community. I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of others on this tonight, because much credit for this heritage citation, in addition to the work of the officers, needs to be given really to the hard work and the persistence of the community over time. I want to acknowledge the many hours of research, emails written late into the night, submissions supporting protection, and commitment to see this home preserved. As for 60 Barclay, the officer's report has covered this well, but most importantly, I think, is that the house was designed by Albion Walkley, and Walkley has been recognized as a prominent architect designing homes in Burndara, particularly in Hawthorne. And the house has a strong association with the architect. I don't know if you saw in the report that we're fortunate that the sketch drawings and plans for the house are actually preserved in the State Library, which is really significant to me. As the officers have noted, and other speakers have noted, there have been differing views of these grand homes in the past. And we did hear from one speaker, from Mr. Twite, that the majority of advice received was that we should let this home go and not protect it. But it's actually, as officers have said, it's not a vote. It's not about, it's not the majority wins. It's about getting the most in-depth, accurate view of these houses, about ensuring that we get the most thorough and accurate picture of them. I think we cannot ignore the assessment and the issues that Peter Barrett has raised with 57 Barclay. One of the speakers, Mr. Young and Ms. Seymour, also highlighted the point that the minister has not addressed this question. We have not asked the question, is this home individually significant? And that is the answer we need to understand. I think the planning scheme amendment process, which will include the public exhibition and the independent panel process, that is the best way. It's the most appropriate way to test the recommendation to include these properties in the heritage overlay. What does the community expect of us in defending some of our most beautiful markers of history? Homes, I think, that connect us to our past and highlight the unique built form. I believe we have a responsibility to ensure that we let this process take place. So I encourage my fellow councillors to also support the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion isn't opposed, so I'm going to put that motion. Those in favour? Those against? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. That takes us to item 3.2, Rosebery Street, Hawthorne East. That report will be presented by Acting Principal Strategic Planner Robert Costello and assisted by Corinne Softly, Senior Associate from Extent Heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study identified the Brickfields Environs Precinct as one of 8 heritage precincts. Rosebery Street was assessed by Council's heritage consultant and was not recommended for inclusion in the heritage overlay, either as a standalone heritage precinct or as part of the Brickfields Environs Precinct on the basis of low intactness. Rosebery Street was not mistakenly missed or overlooked. The advice from Council's heritage consultant was the application of heritage controls in Rosebery Street was not strategically justifiable. Context is a highly experienced built heritage consulting firm who has advised Council's strategic planning team for many years. This report considers the advice provided by Context and Extend Heritage in response to the community nomination for Rosebery Street lodged by residents and interested parties with Council in July of this year, following recent demolition activity in the street. Context letter of advice is provided at attachment 1 to the report. Context has reiterated through the Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study that Rosebery Street does not meet the threshold under the HERCON criteria to justify its inclusion in the heritage overlay. This is on the basis of low intactness. Context has found there are too few contributory buildings remaining and too many properties which would be graded non-contributory. Further, no links of strategic importance can be drawn between the built form of the street and the former Hawthorn brickworks. Extent Heritage was commissioned to prepare an independent assessment of the street and a peer review of the nomination and the views of context. The advice prepared by Extent Heritage is provided at attachment 2. Extent Heritage has also found Rosebery Street does not meet the threshold for inclusion in the heritage overlay under the HERCON criteria. This includes Rosebery Street in full and in part. Officers acknowledge the submission lodged by residents on this matter. Unfortunately, officers are not in a position to recommend the application of heritage properties in the absence of professional advice to do so. Ultimately, officers could not reasonably expect the Minister for Planning or his delegate to authorise any request made by Council to prepare and exhibit an amendment to the Burundara planning scheme to implement heritage controls in the absence of professional advice provided by a qualified heritage consultant. In relation to the independent peer review, Ms. Corinne Softly, Senior Associate with Extent Heritage, is in attendance this evening to respond to matters arising and questions from councillors with respect to the peer review. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So 14 people have indicated they wish to make a submission on this matter. Once I've announced your name, a member of the governance team will enable access to the meeting, so you'll be able to make your submission. If a submitter is not present when their name is called or a submitter experiences a technical issue, we will move on to the next speaker. Once all speakers have made their submission, we will again attempt to hear from any speaker who has experienced technical issues. I remind submitters there's a strict time limit of 3 minutes, and we'll ask each of you to commence your presentation with your name and the suburb in which you reside. Please don't repeat what earlier speakers have said. We only need to hear a submission once, and with 14 speakers, it will take a significant time. So if when we get to you, what you would have submitted has already been said, then by all means feel free to let us know that you don't need to speak. The first presenter is Richard Arbon, who'll be followed by Christina Brannigan.
Hi, panel, can you hear me?
We can, Mr. Arbon,
Hey.
so yes, go ahead.
Well, good evening, councillors, council officers and other attendees. Yes, I'm the first presenter. I'm going to present to a PowerPoint which I think is going to be put up.
Okay, and while we're doing that, if you could just start with your name and suburb, thanks.
Sorry, yes, my name is Richard Arbon and I live in Camberwell, so not far from Rosebery Street. Okay, can you see the screen?
We can.
Okay, next slide, please. So look, I'm just here trying to just clarify and establish exactly what we're talking about in terms of location. So we can see on the left-hand side an aerial view of where Rosebery Street sits in relation to Fritz-Holzer Park. And it's the site of the old brickworks and runs along the northern boundary. On the right-hand side, you can see a 19th century painting of that brickwork, showing it was a pretty substantial place. And I guess if we imagine that Hawthorn at the time was a lot smaller, certainly a much smaller population, that would have been a very, very substantial location and indeed works in Hawthorn at the time. Next. This is also another view of the same location. So this is from a 1904 plan, brickworks plan, and you can see exactly where Rosebery Street again sits in relation to the brickworks, kind of right along the northern boundary. Next. This is a view today. So this is the original entrance to the Munro Street end of the street. And this is really where you enter a 19th century streetscape largely. And as you walk along the street, despite the fact that there are some later built homes, it's very clear in a workers' cottage street. That's what I'm going to show in a second. Now I'm going to go through just a few slides just showing some of the properties along that street. So here are just two. I won't speak to each of them individually. Another two, another two, another two. Sorry, could you slow down slightly? Another two. As you can see, they're all period homes, right? Some with a little bit of modification, but substantially period. Another two, Another 2. Another 2. More Victorian homes. Same. 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 So I think probably, hopefully you're getting an impression. I mean, I guess this is like a very speed walk down the street of a street which actually has, right, there's one a little bit dilapidated there, but mostly in pretty good state of repair and some in very good state of repair, that has a lot of intact Victorian properties on it. Indeed, what we're going through here is sort of between 40 and 50 of those properties, which is...
30 seconds remaining.
Okay, so here we have the boundary fence. This was alongside the brickworks, which was, there were entrances into the brickworks that the workers from that street used to go through, presumably to the brickworks. Next. And here we have an overlay of the grading map. As you can see, the green properties, obviously, of the houses we're talking about, the contributory, a fairly substantial number in total. And certainly if you want to look at that in a different way, you could see it would be very easy to make an L-shaped contributory or protected area out of that.
Okay, and that's time, I'm afraid.
Okay.
So I'll need to take that down, and I'll just see if there's any questions from councillors. I'm not seeing any. So thank you for your presentation, and I'll move on to Christina Brannigan, who will be followed by Nerida Muirden. Ms. Brannigan.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Christina Brannigan. I live in Camberwell, not very far from Rosebery Street, which is a street that I've always considered a heritage place. I want to thank the officers for the work they've undertaken, and particularly to Councillor Biggar and Gillies. Our group really pleased tonight that Council delays any decisions about Rosebery until a little more work has been explored and a meaningful meeting is held between the residents who petitioned and put in a submission. We think there's room to question some of the report's conclusions. First, I want to say that we are concerned by process. The community was refused a meeting with officers to speak to their submission after spending well over 100 hours preparing it. We've been given only 1 week to respond as a response. This does seem unreasonable and disappointing. But setting that aside, our main responses are that we question the use of a simplistic quantitative approach looking at the percentage of contributory houses. This does not seem to be the appropriate key measure. The primary consideration should be whether the street reads as heritage on the ground. And as we've seen, and as we also believe, the street has huge historical connections to the Fritz-Holzer brickworks, and this has not been fully researched yet, as context accept. Then the 53 heritage places on a short, narrow street is a huge number, and we think this should be highly significant in any decision that's made. We don't agree that adding 53 heritage places to a precinct of around about 200 would degrade it. And if this really is a concern, then a solution is to include only most of the intact parts of Rosebery Street, perhaps in an L configuration, thereby adding 41 places and giving that part of Rosebery Street a 75% grade, and also thus giving the precinct another 41 important places. So the reason we should protect Rosebery Street is that it is an important historical street and long recognised as a heritage street by the community. Community wants it protected, and 1,000 people have told council via an online petition we started only a couple of weeks ago. People living around this old part of Hawthorne East and Camberwell, as I do, understand what is and isn't heritage around them. We are informed people. So how could we protect Rosebery? Well, it's widely accepted that guidelines for precinct creation are not definitive and there are grey areas. So we ask council, please, to look for a new solution. Specifically, we think the reports did not re-explore or report in depth on 2 approaches to precinct creation that we had proposed in quite detail in our community submission. The first thing we proposed was that the appropriate qualitative heritage question as to whether the street still reads as a heritage place is the key question. We've spoken to several heritage experts who've told us that the key question is, what story is the street still telling us today about its history and architecture? And is it still clearly telling us the story of the theme of the precinct we are creating? We believe that it does. Rosebery Street reads to the passerby as a 19th century, early 20th century worker cottage street. And we believe that if someone gets out of a car and takes the time to walk down the street, they will find the answer to be yes. And
okay, thank you. That's time, I'm afraid. I'll just see if there's any questions. There don't appear to be. So we have one from Councillor Franco.
Thank you. Just a question on process. You said, Christina, that you were refused a meeting. Can you explain what that refusal involved?
Yes, we put together a very detailed submission. As I said, probably spent over 100 hours of our time, and we said that we were going to put the submission in. Initially, we were told that we would be allowed to have some kind of meeting to talk through our submission, and then we were contacted to be told that the decision had been changed and we were no longer permitted to meet with a strategic planner. Okay. Yeah. And we contacted them and asked why, but we were very baffled as to why we weren't able to sort of, if you like, speak to our submission, you know. And we're feeling again that
okay, well, we'll have officers respond to that in due course.
Chair, could I ask one question on substance? Christina, you said that there were two, in relation to precinct creation, you said that you would have liked to see two options that you'd presented more detailed, separately considered. I understood from your presentation one option may have been that the precinct was how it reads. Is that correct? Was there a second approach?
Yes, the first one was we wanted very serious response about whether the precinct still read as a contributory, as a heritage place, which we think it does. And nobody walked, well, extent walked on the street, but we don't believe context did. The second one, I think Nerida Muirden is going to cover. It's around the historical significance. We actually believe that this street is far more historically significant than the current research undertaken would suggest, and that there's plenty of opportunity without a lot of cost to do extra historical research that the community could help with.
Okay, thank you. I'll also help with, just so you don't gazump Ms. Muirden's. Councillor Thompson, you had a question?
I did. Thank you. Through you, Chair, to Ms. Brannigan. In your presentation, you referenced that you had some heritage advice about viewing a heritage precinct as on ground. Who was the heritage consultant, and did they have a look at Rosebery Street specifically?
No, they're not people who've looked at Rosebery Street specifically. I guess as part of the Boroondara Heritage Group, we're forming contacts with people in the heritage space. So I don't feel it's appropriate to say the names of people, but I can say one is an eminent professor who operates in the heritage space, another a consultant the council has used, and they both told us that the key question when we're determining whether
I think that's answered the question. Thank you.
Okay.
Is there any further question? No. Thank you for your presentation, and we'll now move to Ms. Muirden, who will be followed by David Haddock.
Hello.
Good evening. If I could ask you to start your presentation with your name and suburb, please.
Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, my name is Nerida Muirden and I live in Camberwell. Good evening and thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm going to focus on two further areas that we would like to provide more response to. The report proposed that Rosebery Street is not as strongly linked to the brickworks theme as other streets in the precinct. We disagree, and this is important to try to consider because contexts say that if the street were more strongly linked, that it would mitigate to some degree the 58% that these 53 contributory houses represent of the whole street. The evidence in our submission and in the report shows that the street is very strongly linked to the brickworks and worker cottages. The Hawthorn Historical Society has provided new evidence to show that the Fritz and Holzer families had land and housing on both sides of the street. The Holzers lived there and provided rentals to brickworkers. This does not seem to us to show any less of a link than the other streets. In fact, probably more than some. We also have oral history that there were entrances to the brickworks from the street. One of our speakers will explain about the entrances that brickworkers and the Holtzes would have used and that some evidence of them survive today. Possibly the easement for the local creek was used as a worker entrance. Contexts state that further research would likely reveal several more properties owned by these families. We believe Council bought some of the Fritz Holzer land in the early 1970s, and research into this could shed more light on whether the company had further houses on the street, which we think is highly likely, as Council later sold off several lots on the street in the late 20th century for development. Another option for Council to consider that was dismissed by the reports is to look at protecting parts of the street. There are some highly intact contributory sections. This is what Council has done in virtually every other street in the precinct, and it is how the high percentage of contributory houses has been achieved. Finally, one report proposes that including Rosebery Street might degrade the precinct. If the real purpose of a precinct is to protect significant heritage places for posterity, then how could adding 50+ heritage houses to a precinct possibly degrade the value of it to a community and to posterity?
30 seconds remaining.
As we already suggested, if Council were to consider including highly contributory parts of the street, this could still remain a very high overall percentage across the precinct. We ask that you sit down with the community and talk through some of these ideas and information together. I think the Burundara community has shown itself capable of sharing valuable ideas and information with Council and has helped protect our heritage. We live amongst it, use it, and are well placed to have an understanding of it. Please.
Thank you. That's time. I'll just check if there's any questions. There are none. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
We'll move now to Mr. Haddock, who will be followed by Peter Bealby. Good evening, Mr. Haddock.
Hello, my name is David Haddock. I live at the west end of Rosebery Street and would like to say a few words. Both consultants used the percentage of contributory versus non-contributory houses as key arguments for not including Rosebery Street. Context state that their rule of thumb is 2/3, and a rule of thumb by its very nature is rough and therefore not appropriate in complex situations. Rosebery Street has a complex history, no doubt, due to the proximity to the brickworks. And I'd say such a rough rule should not be the key deciding factor to determine whether the worthiness of heritage protection of Rosebery Street applies. It's disappointing it seems to play such a dominant part of the recommendation. It's concerning that the percentage has only been determined in a single way and no thought seems to have been given to the actual development of Rosebery Street over time. Old maps show Rosebery Street had vacant land to the south side, closest to the park, in about 3 places in 1904. We know in some cases this continued for many years. We also know there were garden allotments in the street at one point and a vacant block long owned by the Fitch family that the whole history suggests was used as a pathway into the brickworks and possibly the tip as well. Other areas were vacant during parts of the 20th century. The context report itself recognises there are only 77 lots developed in 1905, and this surely is the maximum number of houses which could give the street what we say is its heritage theme. Yet we are being measured against there being 92 houses, and that doesn't make sense to me. If we look at the 53 contributory houses as a percentage of 77, that's 69%. And even though I've just spoken against a simple rule of thumb test, it would pass the required minimum. So I want to say, we can see how basic and dangerous it is to apply a simplistic measure. The question is, does the street meet the theme of the precinct? In my view, it clearly does. When you walk the street, it articulates as a heritage area that warrants protection. And this will be supported by information others provide tonight. I also, I know this has been already said, but I registered my complaint that I received this the notification for this meeting by a letter dated 21 September, only about a week ago. And it has not allowed enough time for consultation, research or understanding to
30
allow a
seconds
proper response.
remaining.
So I ask that Council, in the absence of a decision to support further processes to obtain heritage protection for Rosebery Street, defer a decision to allow proper consultation, which I think would be good governance. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just check if there's any questions. There doesn't appear to be, so thank you for your submission. And that takes us to Mr. Bilby, and he'll be followed by Darren Simcox. Good evening, Mr. Bilby.
Good evening, how are you?
Good, thanks. If you could just start your presentation with your name and suburb, please.
My name is Peter Bilby and I'm from Hawthorne East.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Number 12 Rosebery Street has been home for me and my partner for 29 years. Initially, I'd like to refer to you to the Table 3 on pages 8 to 10 of the Extent Heritage Report to identify specific errors. In the table, properties 1 and 1A are graded as non-contributory because they are assessed as late 20th century buildings. The owners have confirmed that the red brick building was completed in 1914 and as such should be classified as late Edwardian. It is clearly well maintained and the brick additions are very sympathetic to that period. It is also understood that the original building was constructed using Fritz Holzer red bricks. For these reasons, we believe the two properties 1A and 1, should be graded as contributory. Also in the table, properties 2 and 4 are classified as Victorian period properties. However, the buildings were built in 1914 and are Edwardian in style and of high integrity. Properties 22, 24, 40 and 42 have been classified as late 20th century buildings. It is clear that the properties were built in the 30s and 40s period, each from red bricks. As the properties have been misclassified, there is no information about whether additions have stopped them being graded as contributory. The grading of some of all of these properties should be re-examined, particularly as 2 of the properties do not have any visible or intrusive additions. It is important to compare the treatment of Rosebery Street to other streets. The full length of most of the streets in the precinct has not been included. The glaring example is Fletcher Street, where only about 1/3 of the length of the street has been included in the precinct, which achieves a contribution of approximately 90%. From an assessment of the full length, Fletcher Street would have difficulty achieving a percentage of more than 60%, yet Rosebery Street is assessed on its full length with a percentage of approximately 60%. Similarly, only approximately two-thirds of Munro Street has been included. If a minimum percentage of contributing properties in a street is deemed essential, though it's not regarded as essential, further time should be devoted to creating models which re-examine the inclusion of all or at least parts of Rosebery Street. Some models could achieve a percentage of more than 75 or 80%. We believe that 53 or possibly 55 properties and arguably 2 to 3 more contribute to the historic importance of Rosebery Street in relation to the life of the brickworks.
30 seconds remaining.
This is impressive, but the raw number of the proportion of properties, though important, is not the complete picture. By not including Rosebery Street in a heritage protected precinct, the council will have in effect admitted that it has given up on a street which is highly valued for its historic streetscape. I ask you to reconsider the inclusion of all or part of Rosebery Street in the heritage precinct. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just check if there's any questions. I'm not seeing any. So thank you for your presentation. And we'll move to Mr. Simcox, who'll be followed by Hazel Scott. And just so submitters are aware, at around about 8 o'clock, we're going to briefly adjourn to open and then adjourn the council meeting and resume this meeting. But we'll see how we land. We'll get through as many of the submitters as we can before 8.
Hello.
Good evening. If I could ask you to start your presentation with your name and suburb, please.
Yeah, Darren Simcox. I'm a 21 Rosebery Street owner. Okay.
Thank you.
I've lived here for about 20 years. It's a historic living street. It's not a grand home as we all know and are admired for decades and protected as such. They're on the other side of the Bluestone laneway in Auburn Grove. We're a blue-collar story behind them, the workers' cottages. In 1896, residents were working class, recorded on their mortgages as carter, labourer, dye, pinker, painter, blacksmith, coach builder, striker, and of course brickmaker. A few people in white-collar occupations, a shipping clerk and engineer. How many of these occupations even exist today? These blue-collar houses are very unrepresentative on any heritage registers. Amazing, they are all 100-year-old weatherboards. This is testament to the craftsmanship and all proudly decorated with Victorian features and built during a depression. We didn't have famous architects, well, at least not many put their names to them. They were just cottages. We didn't have grand detail plans carefully stowed away for consultants to research. The history is in the story from the elderly resident families, many who grew up as kids playing in the brick pits. Ernest Dixon, whose father was a brickmaker, his childhood memories of visiting his grandmother at number 80. His grandfather was Daniel Dixon, brother-in-law to Anson Holzer, working in the brickworks down in William Street, Rocket Park as we know it. Joined Anton, bringing the Holzer side into fruition. His uncle Anton appearing from nowhere over the back fence from the brickworks. This brings us to access paths or gates to the brickworks. Well, they're still there. Have a walk along the back fences of Fritz Holzer Park. Now have a look at the goat tracks around the pits, the aerial brickworks photos. They lead to the edges of the pits, the back fences, vacant blocks and the watercourse bisecting the street. That didn't go into a pipe until later. Many still had bricks, the seconds given to the residents by the brickworks to make their pathways dropped in the mud. I found 4 layers in my original path. You could walk through your neighbour's property on the south through to the north. Can you imagine that today? Now, my place. 20 years ago, the son of the previous owner visited whilst I was restumping. If you happen to find a gun under there or in the walls, we've been looking at it for our whole life. Dad told us on his deathbed that the previous owner told him about the time that Squizzy Tail, his bodyguard, who lived in 21, had taken possession of a gun from one of his crime squads. Was it the murder of the bank manager in Glenferrie Road? I'm yet to find it. The brick kilns are all gone now, but the bricks, even though are gardens and chimneys, still remain. They're everywhere. Nobody gives them a second thought. That's up until they end up in a demolition bin. Give some thought to unravel our oral histories or even record a few more. It's up to you to make sure they'll still be there so the next passionate restorer can find them.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions. There don't appear to be, so thank you for your presentation. And we'll move now to Hazel Scott, who will be followed by Christine Butler.
Good evening.
Good evening. If I could ask you to start your presentation with your name and suburb, please.
My name's Hazel Scott. My home is 3A Rosebery Street, Hawthorne East.
Thank you.
I have a long time personal involvement in the street, so I wish to talk about my sense of the area's history. Arriving in Camberwell in 1961, frequently I was driven around the local suburbs by my mother-in-law Alma Scott, formerly a Rigby, and often Auntie Hilda would join us. Hilda was a Holzer and loved to recount many tales of her family and their connection to the brickworks, and in particular to the homes provided for the workers by the Fritz and Holzer families. Family involvement with the workers' well-being was a matter of pride. Homes were made available for purchase and rental, indicative of the thinking in that era of the importance of housing people nearby to their work. The families Rigby, Scott and Holzer were enmeshed in Boroondara. The Rigbys owned the dairy in Victoria Road, and the Scotts a building where the aerial apartments were built in recent times at Camberwell Junction. The Holzers and the Fritz families had many properties for the families in and around Rosebery Street, in what was known as the Grove Estate, and Rosebery Street known as Garfield Street. And for example, number 17 Rosebery was owned by John Holzer, and 73 Rosebery was owned by the Holzers and subsequent children. There was at least one marriage between the Holzer and the Fritz families. The Hawthorne Historical Society has many references to homes in Rosebery belonging to the two families, and Auntie Hilda talked of playing with cousins and about many family gatherings. I moved to my current home in Rosebery Street in 1992. The father of one of my neighbours was a Greek migrant who, along with 4 other men, had rented my house in the late 1950s. Until when we renovated 17 years ago, there was evidence of their individually locked bedroom doors. A couple of the men went on to buy properties in Rosebery Street. This evidence is of a later period in the history of Rosebery Street, but nonetheless important in the overall history of migration and settlement, which goes way beyond Boroondara. So this street has many tales to tell of the history of lives in Boroondara, from the Victorian era, Federation, pre- and post-war, and particularly about the social history of Rosebery Street. We place a high emotional importance on our physical spaces. These spaces become a reflection and relics of ourselves, both individually and collectively as a society. In the future, it would be sad if we were only able to look at photographs of heritage homes rather than having the ability to walk down the street and see the real thing, appreciating the way life was lived. Given that the same company was asked to report again to Council and the second only did a review, it is unsurprising that the outcome would be any different without fresh eyes. The process does not really feel like best practice. We ask that tonight no decision is made to refuse heritage overlay for Rosebery Street so that a decent amount of time can be given to researching the street thoroughly. Once these homes are demolished, they can never be replicated.
Okay, thank you. I'll just check if there's any questions. There doesn't appear to be. So thank you for your presentation. And we'll move now to Christine Butler, who'll be followed by Sarah Thiel.
Can you hear me?
We can. If I could ask you to start with your name and suburb, please.
Christine Butler, Rosebery Street resident. Good evening. I have great respect for Boroondara Council and believe that in the past they have taken a responsible attitude to many similar situations. I'm grateful for the time allocated to me to plead this matter on behalf not only of myself but many like-minded neighbours. I'm asking the Council to give us more time before deciding the future of our street. It has been difficult with COVID restrictions to put together our arguments in only a week since the extant heritage report. I'm a newbie here. I'm purchasing in 2010 because of the beautiful feel of this historic area. Houses purchased around that time have all been renovated. Combined with its gardens and its trees, I believe it would be a heritage disaster if this could be lost to the bulldozer. For information received, I'd like to point out the following. Rosebery Street, or Garfield Street, the original name, was developed in the late 1800s and was entered from Wolseley Street. This was also the time that the Fritz Holzer brickworks came into being. The architectural history starts here at the West End with its perfect Victorian and Edwardian double-fronted and single-fronted brick and timber homes. There was no access at that time to either Bowler Street or Camberwell Road. My connection to the brickworks and the Fritz Holzer family is that John Holzer was a mortgagor on my property until 1918, when the house was purchased by George Hicks, a labourer. We count ourselves fortunate that there are a number of heritage houses still existing on the south side of the street. After the brickworks closed, the quarry became the municipal tip from 72 to 88. I believe some houses were lost due to unstable land and being uninhabitable due to the proximity to the tip. There was also vacant land and garden allotments, so understandably there are a number of newer infill homes. Victorian homes were not wantonly destroyed on purpose, but due to the tip. This is how this street evolved, and it all is part of the history of an inner working class suburb. Does the council want to downgrade the importance of the heritage homes still standing? Are these 53 much loved homes to now run the risk of demolition? Purchasers were drawn to this street because of the heritage houses. And in recent years, up until 2020, none of these houses were being destroyed.
30 seconds remaining.
Please take a moment to walk our street, specifically from Wolseley Street, where you will experience the real history unfolding. Take in the feel of the street and what will be lost if these heritage homes are not preserved for future generations. Once gone, they cannot be restored. Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you. I'll just check if there's any questions. There doesn't appear to be, so thank you for your presentation. So that takes us to Sarah Thiel, and she'll be followed by Jane Vassos. Good evening, Ms. Thiel. If we could ask you to start with your name and suburb, please.
My name is Sarah Tearley from Hawthorne East.
Thank you. And if you could commence your presentation.
My husband David and I have owned our home on Rosebery Street for 27 years. We purchased a run-down, double-fronted Edwardian house with some beautiful period features, Fritz Holzer bricks in the backyard path, and transformed it into a much-loved family home. We do remember receiving the council letter in relation to the heritage study, though most of our neighbours we speak with have no recollection of this. At the time, we did not fully understand the implications of its specific detail and the disastrous ramifications this would cause years later. Other neighbours have expressed similar sentiment. Maybe we were simply a bit naive in believing the council would be protecting heritage homes, or that most people were like us and would want to preserve these beautiful homes. Until recently, homes on Rosebery Street have been restored, historical details preserved, and the results mainly in sympathy to the house's heritage and the overall streetscape. You only need to walk down our street to see these examples. However, in the last 12 months, houses are now being demolished, and we are now shocked that recently 4 homes are completely gone. To see the bulldozer move in, dust rise, and a short time later the house being carted away in a tip truck is devastating and very unsettling. In 1885, the street was marketed by the real estate agent as 43 magnificent villa sites and the only cheap land remaining in Hawthorne. In contrast, today, the marketing flyers mention exceptional opportunity with no heritage overlay. This period home is ready to make way for a range of new home or redevelopment possibilities. A younger couple who recently purchased a single-fronted house in the street also told me that they were given this exact spiel from the selling agent for their house. Please preserve the heritage of Rosebery Street for future generations and give us more time to ensure we can stop any more houses the fate of a bulldozer. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's no questions there, so we'll move on to Jane Vassos. And after Ms. Vassos has submitted, then there'll be an adjournment. And then we'll hear from the final 4 presenters after the adjournment. And the first speaker up will be Brock Ubergang. So we'll move to Ms. Vassos.
Good evening all, and thanks for taking the time to listen to our pleas to help save our heritage street. I also live in East Hawthorne and have been a resident of Rosebery Street for 25 years, having preserved and renovated a Victorian cottage using Fritz Holzer bricks. I can't tell you how heartbreaking it was to witness some beautiful renovated Victorian cottages being reduced to rubble. We do not want to experience this again. These homes represent our history, housing local workers that helped establish the early community of Auburn, Hawthorne East, and all have a story to tell. We don't have all the stories, but need your help to keep the door open on this review. We'd like to get together to establish that a lot of these stories will be linked to the Fritz Holzer brickworks. You only have to look at the map to determine that this would have to be the case. But I want to update you on our recent story. We lodged a signed petition with 72 signatures to your offices, most being from Rosebery Street residents and other neighbouring streets. We had a very supportive response in favour to protect the heritage homes in our street. Most people could not believe that they were not protected and were shocked when these homes were destroyed. The petition was lodged with council and was acknowledged during the recent meetings. During the lockdown, unfortunately, I'm sure we would have had more signatures. A change.org was also created to highlight to a wider audience what can happen if we don't protect our heritage homes. In over a week, we had an overwhelming response of over 1,000 supportive signatures. Most of them local, and 6 of the following comments were from Boroondara residents. 1, stronger protection needs to be placed on the protection of Boroondara's heritage properties and streetscapes such as Rosebery Street. The city's heritage belongs to all of us. 2, it's important that the character of this area is maintained. 3, our history matters. 4, the mighty dollar should not overshadow the value of beauty and heritage. 5,
30 seconds remaining.
okay. Ridiculous that these glorious homes were not included in the Brickfield precinct. Quaint streets like Rosebery Street represent the history of Boroondara. If nothing is put in place to protect the heritage of this area, we will find with time it will erode the history of what this area represents. The street tells a story of a heritage street. Real estate agents have used the phrase "in a period landscape" in their marketing campaigns.
Thank you. I'll need to stop you there because that's time. I'll just check if there's any questions. There don't appear to be any questions. So thank you for your presentation. For the submitters that haven't yet presented, we'll be back shortly, and I seek a motion to adjourn. Councillor Sinfield, seconded by Councillor Hollingsworth. I'll put that to the vote. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. We stand adjourned. Thank you. I'm seeking a motion to reopen the meeting. Councillor Sinfield, and seconded by Councillor Bigger. I'll put that motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. And to any members of the public who might be confused about all of that, the council meeting, which follows this committee meeting, was called for 7:45, and under the legislation, it has to commence within half an hour of its starting time. And since this meeting won't have concluded within that half hour, we need to go through that procedural step. For anyone online waiting for the council meeting, it will follow the conclusion of this meeting. So that takes us to Mr. Ubergang, who will then be followed by Mr. Johnson. Mr. Ubergang, good evening.
Good evening.
If I could just get you to start with your name and suburb, please.
Yeah, Brock Ubergang, Hawthorne East.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the council for the opportunity to present. I fully support what has been concluded by the officer to not include Rosebery Street under heritage control. Approximately 10 years ago, we purchased a single-fronted residence at the end of Rosebery Street, Hawthorne East. Like many others on the street, we purchased for many reasons, but 2 of the more important reasons were affordability. Rosebery Street, given its block size, was and still is an affordable entry point into the residential market in Hawthorne East. Renovation potential. There were and still are numerous blocks on the street being offered with unencumbered renovation potential. Our intention was to buy a property that allowed us to expand the footprint of our house when we were ready to do so. This was and remains a common theme up and down Rosebery Street, which many families on the street have been able to achieve and others hope to. In the 10 years since we've purchased, a non-standard block size being wider and shorter than most single-fronted blocks in Rosebery Street, we've seen numerous changes to the streetscape, where individuals and families have been able to explore dwelling potential with no heritage restrictions. We've seen multiple dwellings add a second story to their residence. 7 of these dwellings are considered contributory to the Victorian Workers' Cottage streetscape. However, their second story has been deemed intrusive. Construction of a high-rise development on the corner of Campbell Road and Rosebery Street containing 75 dwellings and 2 retail premises. Construction of 2 ultra-modern double-storey townhouses where the first floor runs the full length of the ground floor. We've seen 5 properties on Rosebery Street being sold for their renovation potential, with applications for demolition and new builds approved in the last 24 months. At least 15 of the 92 dwellings that exist in Rosebery Street have been modified or built in the last decade and have not contributed to a Victorian cottage streetscape. All the above has occurred without interested community members from Rosebery Street requesting heritage inclusion. My questions are, is it fair and reasonable that so much change has occurred that has allowed for so much of the street to benefit from non-heritage inclusions, and now we're asking the same street to have restrictions imposed for those that haven't been able to achieve their goals yet? Is it fair and reasonable that some dwellings in the street that are requesting heritage overlay inclusion are also dwellings whose recent modifications have negatively impacted the ability for Rosebery Street to present a Victorian workers' cottages streetscape?
30 seconds remaining.
Rosebery Street has been through 2 heritage assessments in the last 4 years, with 3 reports being generated by independent heritage experts. All have indicated that inclusion is not justified. Rosebery Street is not of sufficient historical, representative, aesthetic or associated significance to warrant an area heritage control. I'd like to thank the council for its transparency since the community nomination was first raised. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions. I'm not seeing any. So thank you for your presentation. And that takes us to Rick Johnson, who will be followed by Greg Deakin. Good evening, Mr. Johnson.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
We can, and if you could just start with your name and suburb, thanks.
My name is Rick Johnson. I live in Hawthorne East. Thanks for the opportunity to present to you. I would like to use my 3 minutes here to do several things. The first thing is to represent the silent majority. There are 92 properties in Rosebery Street, yet there are only a handful of signs advocating that we will oppose inappropriate development in our street. Therefore, there's a large silent majority who are indifferent, or more importantly, don't have the time to defend their rights. There are many young, hard-working families in the street, some of whom may be doing it tough at the moment, homeschooling, working from home, maybe even unemployed. They haven't got the time or energy to fight against the minority that have brought this matter to the council. They trust in the fact that they've got elected councillors to represent them in situations exactly like this. An interesting side note here is that the community nomination talks extensively about the single-fronted works cottages, and yet none of these in the street have felt the need to put up a sign advocating their support. The second thing I'd like to do is question the motivation of the residents who have initiated this community nomination. I suspect the motivation behind this community nomination is not to preserve the heritage significant of Rosebery Street, but to simply reduce the inconvenience of having homes built or renovated in their street, and they definitely don't like new architecture. The flyers placed in letterboxes mentioned protecting houses from demolition, preserving the street character. However, in my observation, which is backed by the reports that the main protagonists this community nomination have already renovated and extended their homes. They have achieved what they wanted. They now want to stop others realising their own dreams. 17 Rosebery Street is a perfect example. This house is a sign that reads, "We will oppose development that degrades our heritage streetscape." Firstly, I can only conclude from this statement that modern architecture must be degrading. I wonder how many of the owners of modern houses in the street feel about their homes being described as degrading. Secondly, this house is classed as contributory by the reports. Its integrity front portion is considered low. It has been renovated by the owner and has a non-heritage front door, different windows, dark brown and grey colour scheme, and what I would describe as a military-style corrugated iron 2-storey extension.
30 seconds remaining.
The fact that this homeowner has already achieved what they want out of a property, a large renovation extension, all without reference to anything heritage, and secondly, without the burden of a heritage overlay. The third thing I'd like to say is I'd like to back the ratepayer-funded reports. As elected councillors, I would implore you to follow the recommendations made in all the ratepayer-funded reports that have been prepared by the experts in this area. They all found against a heritage overlay for the following reasons: no strong historical community links, no houses of historical significance, too few contributing properties even for a general historical overlay, and low intactness of the majority of the Victorian houses for general heritage overlay.
Thank you. I'll need to stop you there, but thank you for your presentation. There don't appear to be any questions, so that takes us to Mr. Deakin, who'll be followed by our final speaker, Joanne Fenton. Mr. Deakin. Mr. Deakin, if you could just commence with your name and suburb, please.
Of Camberwell. Can you hear me?
We can.
The paper before Council reiterates the view that Rosebery Street has been excluded from the Brickfields and Environs Precinct, HO 841, because of the level of demolition and development in the street as a whole. However, the situation merits closer analysis. In their reports, extent, heritage and context have indicated that around half of the 92 properties in Rosebery Street are contributory. That is, the street has an intactness of around 50%. But it's the 50 or so contributory properties that give Rosebery Street its charm. The issue should be whether a coherent portion of these contributory properties might be able to be included in the heritage area. The two reports from the heritage consultants have not addressed this question. In particular, should the western section of Rosebery Street that abuts the heritage area be included in HO 841? The report by Extent Heritage claims to have made an assessment of the integrity and intactness of individual properties. However, this information is not presented clearly. Figure 2 in their report presents a useful summary of contributory versus non-contributory properties, but the table that follows is not complete. The street numbers are obscured, so the details of the assessment of individual properties cannot be located geographically on Figure 2. This is important because the information in the table is highly relevant in considering which portion of Rosebery Street might be included in an extension of the heritage area. This is most unfortunate. A more focused analysis based on Figure 2, but without the granular detail provided in the table, shows that the intactness of a substantial part of Rosebery Street can be rated as high or moderate, depending on the number and location of houses considered. I've identified 5 options based around the western end of Rosebery Street, with an intactness ranging from 85% to 66%. All of these options meet the rule of thumb that in a heritage area, 2/3 of a streetscape should be comprised of contributory properties. Option 1 is a conservative one, limited to the western section immediately adjacent to the heritage area. It comprises 22 contributory properties, number 1 to 20 and 26 properties overall, 1 to 29 on the north side and 2 to 20 on the south.
30 seconds remaining.
I'm sorry?
30 seconds remaining.
I don't have time to run through the other options here, but I submit that consideration of this agenda item should be postponed to a future council meeting so that the detail of the Extent Heritage report can be recovered, the situation better analysed and a positive motion put forward to include part of Rosebery Street in the Brickfields heritage area. I submit that a review of Brickfields and environments should also look at more closely at both Rosebery Street and Fletcher Street with a view to enhancing the heritage protection of this fascinating area.
Thank you. I'll just check if there's any questions. There are none, so thank you. And that takes us to Ms. Fenton, our final presenter this evening.
Can you see and hear me? No.
You can, if you could just commence with your name and suburb, please.
Good evening, Chair and councillors. I'm a resident of Auburn Grove, Hawthorne East, located close to Rosebery Street, and my name is Joanne Fenton. From a heritage perspective, my street was destroyed by wholesale demolition of period homes with established canopy gardens in the 1960s, then replaced by blocks of flats. The remaining 2 Italianate mansions had been saved, but one required a huge community effort as it had been overlooked by the Heritage Advisor at the time. Unfortunately, the workers' cottages did not get the same protection. With this history, it is clear why the local Rosebery Street community are presenting tonight their arguments for you as our elected representatives to support them with their heritage protection endeavours. Rosebery Street still remains sufficiently intact and historically permanently tied to the brickworks it bordered to warrant protection. For many years, the residents of the street were part of the rhythm of those brickworks that helped build so many of Hawthorne and Camberwell's gracious period villas. The everyday comings and goings of the brickworks were witnessed by the residents of these simple cottages. Today, the street is a reminder of this era and the beginnings of our suburbs. It should not be devalued by what has been allowed to be lost in the past, but rather cherished for what remains. With regard to the question of 58% intactness, I would argue that yes, this is sufficient to justify protection. The current contemporary homes are small scale and importantly do not dominate the landscape. This allows the Victorian and early century cottages to rightfully protect their historical influence of place in the street. Their inclusion in the Brickfields precinct would enhance rather than detract from the overall integrity of the area. In closing, I would therefore ask you, our councillors, to either include Rosebery Street in this precinct or confer contributory status to the individual properties in a heritage overlay area in its own right. I'd also like to note that contributory protection can still do modern extensions. So please save what we have left in Rosebery Street. Thank you.
Thank you. And there don't appear to be any questions. So thank you for your presentation. And I'll return to Mr. Costello, the matters arising.
Thank you, Chair. I do propose to touch on several matters which have been raised this evening with respect to Rosebery Street, and ultimately I'll also introduce Ms. Softley to the meeting as well, and I'll seek her to deal specifically with the submission by Mr. Bill around 1A and number 1 Rosebery Street, as well as discuss her findings with respect to the western end of Rosebery Street, which she has made specific commentary on in her letter of advice. Firstly, I'll deal with certain matters before I do that. And what we've heard tonight can be summarised in often what we see as officers in this area, and that is the tension that often exists between the reality, between the perceptions and the lived experience of residents of a particular area and the realities of professional advice and technical expertise that officers must rely on, together with those who would ultimately hear matters such as this at a planning panel, and ultimately what the Minister for Planning will also be looking for when they are assessing, firstly, whether a planning scheme amendment should even be authorised to apply heritage controls, but also what a planning panel will consider when they are ultimately making decisions on whether a planning scheme amendment should be either supported or ultimately abandoned. And this goes to the questions that have been raised this evening around matters such as oral histories, emotional association and attachment to the street, social history, which is held by property owners and others in the area that, that really demonstrate that a particular area may mean something to them. And that is often very different to the reality that we face and which professional heritage advisors face when they are ultimately making recommendations as to whether heritage controls should be applied to the built form that remains in the street. That is ultimately a measure that we are putting in place, that we have to make a decision on and ultimately make recommendations on, which is to control built form outcomes through a planning scheme. What we found since 2018 is that When Context did the Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study, they assessed this street at that time, and they assessed it from the perspective of the full street, and they assessed it from the perspective of whether precincts can be identified within the street itself. Context found in 2018 that could not be justified. It could not be justified to include the entire street, and it could not be justified to include the western end or any other end or any part of the street as part of what then became the Brickfields Environs Precinct, which was ultimately recommended and taken forward into Amendment C308. We also have in 2018 a process which we undertook called preliminary consultation, which is a process we undertake for each and every one of the heritage gap studies which we have undertaken over the past 5 years, where we release the findings and recommendations of a study before it is adopted, and ultimately the plan scheme amendment process is commenced. During that process, letters are sent to each and every property owner and occupier in the entire suburb, not just the affected property owners or the adjoining property owners. In the case of Rosebery Street, each and every one of the property owners and occupiers was sent a letter, and that is recognised by the commentary made by Ms Teal in her commentary, that the letter they were sent ultimately said they were not affected by the recommendations. During that process, officers did not receive a single submission from any resident in Rosebery Street, nor did we receive any submissions from residents of Rosebery Street during the public exhibition process for Amendment C308, which is the second stage of consultation we undertake as part of the municipal-wide heritage gap study during a formal amendment process. What we then had a situation arose where we've had 4 demolitions at least in Rosebery Street in recent times, and that has been the driver behind the community nomination, to use the heritage overlay as a means to protect whatever is left of the street and to seek to use that mechanism as a means of achieving that. And we received the community nomination. We then refer that, and that was made very clear to all of the residents, that we were going to refer that submission to Council's heritage consultant, which is Context, and we were also going to carry out an independent peer review of that community nomination, and Extent Heritage were appointed to do that review. Context have re-evaluated their initial advice in 2018 and have confirmed that heritage controls cannot be justified. It is on the basis that no substantive strategic links can be made between the realities of the built form in 2021 and the Hawthorne brickworks, albeit that, yes, it is acknowledged that Rosebery Street is adjacent to the Hawthorne brickworks to its north. In addition to that, an assessment was made of intactness of the street, and it was also deemed that the intactness of Rosebery Street means that it can also not be justified to apply heritage controls to private land. Extent Heritage were then appointed to carry out an independent peer review, and they carried out a site visit as part of that, and the outcomes of that are in their advice. Extent Heritage too have found that no heritage controls can be justified for Rosebery Street, and their advice is documented in attachment 2. So what we find ourselves in is a situation where we didn't have a lot of demolition activity occurring in 2018 when that advice was developed by Context through the Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study. We now have started to see demolition activity, which ultimately drives a community nomination. Unfortunately, the heritage overlay cannot be used as a means of controlling development outcomes in order to stop and hinder demolition activity, which has been occurring for many, many decades in this particular street. Yes, it can be used to inform and trigger a decision, but it ultimately cannot prohibit. So where does this leave us? Ultimately, council officers are bound by the professional advice given by our advisors. And that puts us in a position, unfortunately, this evening, where we are not in a position to recommend heritage controls be applied. I'm also going to hand over shortly to Ms. Softley to speak to 1A Rosebery Street, as well as the western end. It is ultimately unfortunate, I think, we think, is that the community nomination was very extensive, and residents are to be commended for that. Ultimately, however, officers are bound by the advice that we receive and the realities of what we face. Ms. Softley?
Yes.
I'll introduce you to the meeting. You are a senior associate of Extent Heritage, and you were the lead consultant who carried out the peer review of Rosebery Street.
I was. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just simply ask you to clarify the points which you identified during the matters arising this evening. Thank you.
No worries. So would you like me to address 1 and 1A first?
Yes, please.
So thank you to Peter for providing that additional information on that property. I have actually looked into that site a little bit further since providing the initial advice. The building, although it is a 1914 structure, it has been heavily altered, such that I would still consider it to be non-contributory. So basically the ground floor facade is intact, as is the semi-detached neighbour. However, both buildings have actually undergone a very highly intrusive upper floor addition, whereby matching materials have been used, but the front setback and the built form has altered the original building such that they do not represent a Federation era building no longer, not like we would expect it to in the rest of the precinct. And I would just point out good comparative examples are 22 to 40 Bowler Street, which are specifically mentioned in the statement of significance. So they would be used, in my opinion, as kind of the threshold for inclusion. Is there anything else on that matter? No, okay. In terms of the western end of the street, you'll see in our letter of advice in the recommendation section that we have actually covered off, a scenario whereby we have considered whether the western end of the street is intact enough, or of a layout, I guess, that warrants its inclusion as an extension to HO 841. We have assessed 3 to 11 and 2 to 20 Rosebery Street as a potential area. However, my advice is that I would not proceed with that recommendation for inclusion for the following 4 reasons. So this is a very small representative example of Rosebery Street, and I guess based on the various submissions I've heard tonight, obviously there's a real there's a real passion for the whole street essentially being of historical value, and this would be a very, very small component of that street. So in my opinion, from a historical significance perspective, I don't think it would meet the criteria. A number of these buildings contain upper floor additions that are quite visible and again quite highly intrusive. Again, these places have been developed without a heritage overlay, so we have a wide variety of upper floor additions happening. HO 841 incorporates whole streetscapes mostly, and it also incorporates both sides of the street. So in consideration of an overlay whereby it may form an L shape and exclude one side of the street, for example, I think that would be inconsistent with what we're seeing with the rest of the precinct. I would also point out that this type of building stock is already very well represented in the existing overlay, and I don't see how it could contribute much further to what is already being presented. That's everything on that matter.
Thank you, Ms. Softley. Chair, I'll hand it back to you. That's all we have for matters arising.
Before I do that, I would like you to address the there was a submitter who indicated they'd sought a meeting and that had been agreed to and then not. Are you in a position to address that submission?
Yes, we were invited to a street walk as well, and we were not in a position to accept the street walk. The residents were advised about how this matter was going to be dealt with, which was that it would be referred to Council's heritage consultant, and officers would not necessarily be meeting with individual submitters or members of the community, members associated with the community nomination. It is acknowledged we have spoken over time with the residents who have been part of the community nomination, but officers did not go and do a street walk, nor did we meet formally with all of the different parties at any one particular point in time.
Okay, thank you. Councillors looking for questions. Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair. This is a question for Ms. Softly, if I could, please. I didn't quite hear the numbers of the house numbers that you referenced, which said didn't stack up, and that was the extension to the Brickworks precinct.
Yep. So 1 and 1A were the initial properties I spoke about.
Yep.
The section that we had considered for, a potential smaller extension to that precinct was 3 to 11 and 2 to 20. Very straight.
Okay.
So they're on the western end, essentially.
Chair, if I can have a follow up with that again through to Ms. Softly on that. So a small precinct is not possible even if it has a higher intactness percentage. Is that what you're saying?
That's not necessarily the case. So there are examples of very small precincts, and we had looked at this as a precinct extension of HO 841, so it would form part of that bigger precinct. However, it's my opinion that this portion of the street is only a very small representative example of Rosebery Street as a whole, and in that instance, it's not representative of the historical significance of the whole street if the whole street is not being included. So that's one factor. The other factor is looking at the existing precincts and how that's put together. It's made up of whole streetscapes and streets that have a clear delineation of both sides of the street and a clear streetscape pattern that you can see. So we've got it would be a very small representative example of Rosebery Street, including buildings which I think are very well represented already in our existing precinct in terms of style.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. Oops, we're on mute, we're off mute, we're on mute. A question I think it's best to Mr. Costello, if I may. Can you advise of any deadlines or timeframes that require a decision to be made tonight, please? And then I'd like to foreshadow a motion, please.
No, the officer recommendation this evening is to not proceed. It's not linked to a planning scheme process or timeframes around getting to exhibition or authorisation requests or panel hearings or anything like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've noted your foreshadowing, and then I have Councillor Stavrou, Councillor Watson, and then Councillor Franco. So, Councillor Stavrou. You're unmuted. Councillor Stavrou, I need you to. We're not hearing you. So I'm going to move to Councillor Watson while we try and resolve.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now, yes.
Sorry about that. It's got 2 mutes on. Thank you, Chair. I have maybe 3 to 4 questions, and I'll address them through the Chair. So sometimes we've heard with these assessments that you can either go through a bottom-up or a top-down approach, and there's a grey boundary as to what becomes ultimately a heritage decision. It's not a perfect science. Can I ask then, is there a sense of how close to a boundary this particular decision is, whether the whole of the street or some parts of the street?
I assume that's directed to myself, Councillor Stavrou.
Either yourself or
Whoever's
Ms. Softly, whoever's best practice. Perhaps Ms. Softly, because she wrote the report.
Sorry, can you just repeat this question?
So what I'd be interested in understanding is sometimes these decisions are not perfect science. And we've often heard that there's a grey boundary as to what makes something heritage or not. How far would you say would this particular scenario be to the boundary, whether you consider it as a whole or some of the parts, as you have already articulated you have?
So I guess when we're talking about integrity, the precinct as a whole, in my opinion, is of very low integrity. It's got as many people have said tonight, we've got 58%, possibly pushing 60 now with maybe a couple of small changes. Contributory graded properties and 40% non-contributory. That is extremely low, and I think I would want to. I'd be very interested to know if there's any other precincts in City of Boroondara that would have an integrity level of that of 60%. I know Sackville Street might be an example, but really where this advice comes from is it's not a perfect science of, it hits 70%, it's a yes or no. Ultimately, we have to look at how is this place going to be managed on the planning scheme? How are we going to apply the heritage overlay to this streetscape? And with such a low level of integrity, it's in my opinion that it's actually got quite a fair way to go in terms of integrity for me for it to meet the threshold. Ideally, we'd be looking at 80% or above. That would be a high integrity precinct. A moderate integrity would sit between 60 and 80, but we really want that to be on the highest end possible, because whilst that's a very physical fabric way of approaching a precinct, and we are obviously dealing with historical significance here, we also need physical fabric to manage that historical significance and to protect that historical significance. Does that make sense? Yep.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it does.
Councillor Stavry, the obvious question that arose in the answer there was whether there's any Boroondara examples.
Yes.
And I might just invite Mr. Costello to indicate whether he's in a position to comment on that.
I'm not in a position in terms of that. I'm commenting on the advice that is attached to the report this evening.
Right, so you're not sure?
Well, as I've said, the Heritage Gap study that we've been looking at for the past 5 years would be recommending precincts that would have a fairly high level of integrity, and that would be on the basis that we've got supportive panel reports for each and every one of those amendments. As I said, I'm not in a position to be doing comparative analysis about precincts that are in Boroondara that have a certain level of integrity this evening or not. I can't answer that question, unfortunately.
Okay.
Mr. Chair. Sorry, Mr. Chair. Sorry, softly.
You go.
I think it's a very difficult question to answer because heritage overlays to precincts have been applied to Boroondara for many decades. So the threshold and the expectations now are very different than what they used to be, say, in the 80s or early 90s or late 90s or even early 2000s. The standard and the level and the threshold that's required to be met to apply a heritage overlay now is much higher than what it used to be in the past. So it's not an easy comparator to say, well, a precinct that was applied in the early 90s, for example, or including the heritage overlay in the early 90s has, 59% potentially. That is not necessarily a relevant comparator now to justify applying a precinct overlay now. A lot has been made also in the verbal presentations tonight by the residents about this rule of thumb of 60%, and it's a very easy one to kind of latch onto, but ultimately we have to trust the advice from the experts too as to what in their experience is defendable through an amendment process.
Okay, thank you.
So again, cross-examined.
I'll return to Councillor Stavry. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think I might know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. What information could emerge to change the recommendation?
In my opinion, I don't see any new information changing my opinion. I know that the community were keen to do some additional research on some properties. However, that would, in my opinion, not really change the integrity that we're seeing with this precinct, and therefore the potential application of the heritage policy to those properties. I think it would be undue.
Thank you. If I could continue, Mr. Chair.
Certainly, yes.
Look, I did drive through the street. You need to purposefully go there, but to my mind, at least some of the houses in the West End do tell a blue-collar story, and I think one of the speakers, I guess, raised it. Doesn't it tell that story in Hawthorn, I guess, where blue-collar work is no longer really the norm? And is that a worthy heritage, I guess, dimension?
Yeah, most certainly. But I guess at the end of the day, I need to look at what's already well represented on the heritage overlay, and consider those factors. So, as I said earlier, these types of properties and the way that they're arranged, the streetscape pattern that they present is already well represented in the existing precinct. So that feeling that you get is, in my opinion, already well protected in the existing overlay.
Sure. And thank you for that. And my final question, if this were to be a thoroughfare, and you know, if this is not a fair question, please don't answer it, but if it were a thoroughfare and more people went through it, therefore they could see the story being told, would that in any way change your thinking about it?
No, I don't think so. It's not really something we consider whether a set of buildings are on a main street or not. Maybe that comes into play if there's a commercial use and it is it's a commercial centre, it's a social centre. But in terms of residential properties, whether they're in a main thoroughfare on a main road or in a quiet private residential area, that's not something that we I guess put weight to when assessing this place against the heritage criteria.
May I have a small follow-up then?
Yep, sure.
So the reason I raised that is obviously I'm quite pleased that you look at the properties or the precincts on merit, but a thoroughfare would go to the fact that it would have more, I guess, of the teaching exposure and the teaching that it can do. That's the rationale. Does that
I do
at
get
all?
that, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that's not an aspect that's considered in the HERCON criteria.
Yeah.
So potentially on social value, but not for residential properties.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. My question's for Ms. Softly. We've heard a lot of really fascinating and interesting social history from our residents tonight, and I'd like to thank them for all the work they've done to present that. And I hear the passion for the place that they live.
I need a question, Councillor Watson.
As a heritage consultant, what weight do you give to the social history in determining whether something receives heritage protection? I'm looking for, the visual is something we all understand, but could you please explain that?
It's certainly something that's important. So we have historical heritage as a criteria that we have to look at, and also social significance as well. And it's certainly an element that comes into play. However, it's very rare to have a precinct or an individual place listed purely because of its historical significance. It's something that's very hard to manage, particularly with the way that the current heritage overlay policy is written. It's very fabric-based. So when I look at a precinct, I really look at it from a physical fabric perspective, and that layer of history, in my opinion, is demonstrated through the built environment. So whilst the street itself is clearly connected to the brickworks, the level of integrity of that street has come down so much that, in my opinion, the historical significance is not strong enough anymore.
Thank you, Ms. Softly, and that concludes my questions, Chair.
Thank you. So, Councillor Franco and then Councillor Bigger.
Thank you. I'd like to ask some questions in relation to the concept of how much of a street needs to be pardon me, I'll try and ask the question more clearly. How much of a percentage of a street needs to be included for it to be accepted as a precinct in its own right? And I ask this question because we've discussed here, so I'll just put a bit of context around it, the idea that maybe the western precinct of the street has more heritage merit, and there are a larger number of intact properties there, or properties we'd have a much higher percentage if we focused on the western precinct. And the argument that I at least heard was a key argument that it wouldn't be done because of the principle that it'd be too small a percentage of the street. Where does this principle come from? Is it a rule of thumb? Is it regularly used? What's the basis for that?
Well, there's no black and white. There's no black and white, just I guess, in the way that we look at percentages of intactness across whole precincts. We use these benchmarks as a guide, essentially, this low, moderate, high integrity. In terms of the number of properties on a specific end of a street, that was really one aspect of my argument. And I guess the other aspects are the representativeness of those buildings and how well represented they are already in the precinct, and then what is the rest of the precinct doing? What does it look like? Does it include whole streets? Does it include both sides of the street? So they're all factors that come into play. So there's no kind of black or white answer into, a certain percentage of a street is intact and therefore it can be attached onto a precinct, if that makes sense.
Is there a rule of thumb around it that you use?
No, not that I could tell you right now on the spot. It's different with every scenario you look at.
We've often as councillors discussed this concept of, how many houses or how many properties need to be included for a precinct to be considered a precinct. And this is the first time I've heard the concept that not only, say, the number of contributing in a surrounding precinct need to be, but that precinct needs to be a substantive component of a street and potentially on both sides. So it's fairly novel.
The number game comes into play when we're talking about streetscape patterns and views and settings, and kind of the built form environment that is set by having a range of low scale workers' cottages in a row. If you have non-contributory properties, quite, in my opinion, some visually dominating properties amongst those sites. And they have also had upper floor additions, which are quite intrusive. That's when we need to start looking at the numbers and how that affects the streetscape pattern that we're seeing. In terms of the number of properties at one end of the street, I guess part of that was really pointing out that this nomination is about Rosebery Street as a whole, and including a portion of Rosebery Street, in my opinion, would not meet the threshold for that historical significance that the community are really speaking about.
One further question, Chair, if I may.
You may, but I need you to focus it strongly as a question.
Okay. Residents have submitted today the idea that the street tells a story that's a 19th century street. I mean, is that something you consider that's valid or not valid?
I think that the level of demolition and new development, or not necessarily new development in the late 20th century and beyond, has lowered that level of social history and historical significance. In my opinion, I don't think it meets the threshold.
Thank you.
Councillor Bigger?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I really don't want to flog this dead horse, but I did want to just go back and clarify one thing that you said, if that's all right, earlier, and because I may have gotten it wrong, but you referred to, so just for clarification, we're talking about 58% sort of in Rosebery Street, but I thought what you said was that this was a very low level, and then you went on to say, and we would consider moderate to be 60 to 80%. And to me, 58 is actually very close to 60. Is that right?
So we consider 60% and below as low, 60 to 80% as moderate, but really what we want to see is the high end of moderate. There's no rule book for this. This is extent heritage methodology. There's no like specific guideline that says you have to fit within.
So it's more extent than because I thought I'd heard as the rule of thumb being sort of 2/3, which is kind of 66 or a bit thereabouts. Don't quote me.
This is extent heritage. This is our methodology. It's fully outlined in the report. And the rationale behind all of that, and it's very consistent with what we've seen in other heritage studies and the way that precincts are assessed more broadly. It would still be on the low end, in my opinion.
Chair, if I may, I just have a few more. So if again, this is just really trying to understand when you said that if a small section, I think when asked by the mayor about whether or not a small section would ever be a precinct, and you affirmed that that would be the case, but you said it doesn't represent a historical representation. I might be getting your words a bit wrong, but so when would a small section sort of be enough? What's in your mind, what's missing? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. There's probably no black and white answer to that because it really depends on what sort of area you're dealing with or what sort of nomination you're dealing with. If it's specific, say a row of double-story terraces and you've got a whole street of them, and they're the items on the street that we want to protect, then sometimes that's a precinct, and that might be one section of a street. It might be a street in a cul-de-sac. It could really go any which way. There's no rule book for that.
So it's a bit
really
about
depend on what sort of site you're dealing with ultimately.
I see, and a bit about maybe what we're looking for, what the brief might be.
Yeah, it's contextual. Yeah.
Okay, so I know you may or may not be able to answer this. This may be a question for Mr. Costello. I'm not sure, but I wonder if what would be helpful for me is to understand how the other streets, such as Monroe Street, and I do know this area quite well, Monroe being in my ward, how do they have a stronger historical connection to the brick fields? I mean, because some of them, I didn't feel that. I mean, I know there are some streets that have very strong, but there are also some that have, I would suggest, a looser link.
Well, from what I understand of the precincts and how intact it is, it's much more intact overall.
So I didn't mean the intactness, I meant the historical connection.
Yeah, so this is the point I'm trying to make, because we've got a much more intact built heritage environment that is representative of the history of the former brickworks. That is more representative of the history because you have physical evidence of that history. I guess it's probably good to think about it this way. If we looked at every street in Melbourne as being significant because it's got a specific history, we'd be listing everything, whether it's got new or old buildings on it. We really do need to use historic heritage, the built historic environment, as a tool to try to preserve that history.
Thank you. Can I ask one last clarification? I think this may be to Mr. Costello, and I promise it's my last one, Chair.
That's fine.
And that is just about one of the speakers, I think it was Mr. Bilby, he raised some questions, obviously about the assessment of homes, and it was difficult in that table to see what went with what. And I just wondered whether you also allude to the fact that maybe there were a few potential changes to be made. Do you believe that there is some existing uncertainty about the classification of some of those styles of houses? Apart from 1 and 1A, which you did speak to, thank you.
Yeah, so I'd still recommend them as non-contributory. 2 and 4 are already graded contributory, so that will have no impact on the current assessment. And I didn't quite get down all of the other numbers that he'd mentioned, but I know 24 and its semi-detached neighbour would most certainly still be graded non-contributory, in my opinion. Even if they are 1930s buildings, one of them has a highly intrusive modern upper floor addition there. and they're also not representative of the 1930s style, which is specifically mentioned in the statement of significance, that being the Old English or the Tudor Revival. So they're my initial, that's my initial feedback on those items. But I didn't quite catch. There might have been one more building.
No, there's a lot coming. So thank you very much. I appreciate that's putting you on the spot. Thank you.
No, that's fine. That's all good. Thank you.
I think Councillor Hollingsworth and no, Councillor Addis, and then the Mayor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm not sure who my question's addressed to, so I'll leave it up to whoever to provide an answer. It relates to the concept of a little precinct at the west end of the street. Now, what I've heard is that the buildings possibly are not intact enough to warrant it, but I'm also trying to clarify what I'm trying to clarify is my understanding that if we were to set up a little precinct, there needs to be a statement that justifies the purpose of that little precinct. And I'm trying to get a sense of whether you think that is possible, not as sort of an adjoinement to the big precinct, but a little precinct of a purpose, with a purpose to being a precinct.
I think my previous advice about that end of the precinct would remain, whether it would be a precinct extension or a precinct in its own right. I'm not sure if Robert wants to speak any further to that.
Yep. That's fine. Yeah, so context, looked at this right through the Heritage Gap study for Hawthorn East. They looked at Rosebery Street from the perspective of its whole and its various parts, and certainly from the Heritage Gap study perspective, context found that neither can be justified. Councillor Oda.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the indulgence for another question. A question for Mr. Costello. Hypothetically, throwing our minds to the future of a council decision here, a small precinct towards the end of Rosebery Street, should it progress to an independent planning panel, absent of a heritage consultant actually supporting it from council, how successful would that be? And a second question to that is, would it be appropriate for the residents to engage a heritage consultant to support council's position?
Thank you through you, Chair. Should officers be in a position where we are recommending a planning scheme amendment be initiated for the inclusion of a small precinct at the western end in the absence of professional advice, I would suggest that the amendment won't make it to panel because it simply won't be authorised in the first place. Officers would struggle to proceed with it in the absence of professional advice, given that officers are not heritage experts. Officers rely on professional advice to guide our activity and our recommendations to council and our operation of the process to implement planning controls through amendments under the Act.
That answers my question. Thank you, Chair.
Now, are there any further questions? Right, then thank you for your assistance, Ms. Softly, and officers. So I'll return to Councillor Gillies, who foreshadowed a motion.
Thank you, Chair. If governance would kindly put that up on the screen, please. Thank you. Thank you. You happy for me to speak to that now? We don't need a seconder, don't we? Sorry.
We'll just give everyone a chance to have a quick read through that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just need that to come down so I can see the screen again. Thank you. And so I'll call for a seconder, Councillor Bigger. And to assist Councillor Gillies, is that motion opposed? Yes, there's opposition there. So Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. And I really would like to thank Mr Costello, Ms Softly and the officers for the work in preparing this report. Planning is a complex area, and even more so when heritage matters are involved. Architectural quality, integrity, intactness, precinct definition, lots of grey areas. The reports are views, yes, from experts in their field. However, those experts have to work within the regulatory frameworks that the government make. And there are clearly many complexities there. Council has repeatedly and will continue to advocate to the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, seeking a review of the regulatory framework to increase Council's ability to protect places of heritage value. Irrespective of tonight's outcome, I urge the community to work with councillors and officers to strengthen that advocacy. History belongs to all of us, the physical and the social. I think we all know that. We've heard from a variety of views tonight, overwhelmingly in support of protection. And over the last 2 weeks, many conversations since Rosebery Street report was available for the community to access, though it's a short time for people to digest a complex matter. Residents have freely admitted they are shocked and horrified at the loss of 4 historic era homes in recent times. They're even more shocked and horrified at the prospect of more losses. Losses to Rosebery Street and losses to Boroondara. Lost in the blink of an eye, to quote one of our previous case presenters. Heritage, its recognition and preservation is undoubtedly a collective responsibility. These are residents who did not realise their street could possibly miss out on heritage protection. It's also fair to acknowledge that not all residents feel the same way. We've heard community representation that believes there is further information yet to be explored. Now, I don't know if that is likely to change any report outcomes. However, I am prepared to give the time for it to be heard in a planned community engagement, a meeting to listen and respond to advice as appropriate in an environment that maybe helps that understanding deepen. The motion before you seeks to defer for a short time. There's no timeline or deadline that requires us to make a decision tonight. I urge you to consider the voices of the community, asking Council not to make a final position tonight, and support this motion, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Other speakers? Councillor Watson, Councillor Hollingsworth, and Worth and Councillor Galt. Councillor Bigger is the seconder. Do you wish to speak now, or will you? No? Okay, so I'll call on Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I know this is slightly out of order, but I really feel the need to seek some clarification, because in the motion it asked, in point 3, it says to seek a further report. Could we have an understanding from the mover of that motion whether they mean a report from officers or a report from an independent heritage consultant? I'm unclear.
I think the motion is put on the basis that that's open-ended, but I'll see if Councillor if Councillor Gillies wants to address that or not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Watson. Look, I'm prepared to have that open-ended. If I don't want to commit the residents to the suggestion that they might engage an external consultant, but I would prefer them to consider that, and I don't think there's been time for that consideration to be done. Thank you.
So, Thank you for your clarification, but I'm actually still unclear because when you say seek a further report, it's open-ended. Are you seeking council to pay for another report or officers to make it? Or are you expecting the residents to go and seek a report and submit it to council before consideration on the
I need to wrap this back to a conclusion. It says seek a report. In the ordinary reading of that, that would mean a report from officers. In the absence of any further words, the normal meaning of that would be a report from officers, and I think that's how it would be interpreted. Unless the CEO wants to correct me, then we'll take that as the position. So if you'd like to speak.
Yes, I would. Thank you.
No, Councillor Stavro after that. Thank you.
Yes, look, I'm opposed to the motion tonight for a number of reasons. And I think, I can't remember whether it was Mr. Wilmanson or Mr. Costello who addressed this and said very clearly that officers lean on the heritage reports that we seek because they are not experts. And we've had two reports that are very clear in their recommendations, and we've had the benefit of hearing directly from one of the authors of the report, Ms. Softly. And so I certainly note that the residents are very passionate about the social history of their houses, but and hence the question that I posed tonight to Ms. Softly is to how much weight do you give to that versus built form, and how do you come up with that equation? And what seemed to be very clear is that the integrity, intactness of the built form was the primary consideration. So while we have heard some fabulous social history, the need to connect it with bricks and mortar does not seem to be supported by the heritage consultant. My other concern about delaying the decision tonight is I don't see any purpose in it, because we are participating in a process that leads to a conclusion, and that conclusion is the process we know very well, which is a submission to a heritage panel with arguments being made for and against, and ultimately, as it happens, it may land on the minister's desk for approval. Now, what we've heard very clearly is that the proposal that Rosebery Street is going to meet the criterion for heritage protection are not there. So I see no purpose for the delay. A report which would no doubt provide some interesting and intriguing examination or presentation of social history still won't meet that bar of integrity of the intact form. So I think that that unfortunately the motion tonight creates a time and a space to perhaps hear more, but it will be to no end. So while I certainly appreciate the effort that has been made to explore the social history and present it to us, what I'm hearing very clearly from the experts is that it will not meet the criterion that has been set by the minister. And should that be unsatisfactory for the residents, as I certainly am hearing it is not, then the minister and the criterion that is set by the state government really needs to be the subject of advocacy, because we don't have the luxury nor the power to change that criterion. So I see no purpose in the delay, and therefore I will not be supporting the motion this evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be supporting Councillor Gillies' motion, and the reason why is I've been very concerned about Rosebery Street for a long period of time. Back in August 2020, 57 Rosebery Street was presented before urban planning with an application to construct a new home, which of course means demolition of an existing heritage home. Now, at the time this application came to council just over 12 months back, this was one of 11 houses in a consecutive uniform section of the street that were all of heritage intactness. Since then, as we've heard from presenters tonight, there's been another 3 or possibly 4 homes lost. Now, whilst I acknowledge what I'm saying, that more heritage has been lost since 2020, I would like every endeavour to be made to consider the merits of preserving what is still there and certainly what is intact. And if that's not the whole street, whether it could be elements of the street. The western end, the cul-de-sac, largely intact and quite magnificent, does tell a story of history of streetscape. And as Councillor Stavros said before, it is based on the heritage of the blue-collar workers and the cottages that were built for them to own or to rent, to live in while working in the brickfields. It talks about a section in time of early development, and Ms. Softly spoke about the area is already well presented, and I agree. There's some magnificent sections that are heritage protected around these precincts, but that doesn't mean that we can't strive to save more and include more and have an even better representation of protected properties. I acknowledge everything that the residents have said tonight has been well founded, well researched, and they've put forward information that may not have been considered in the context report or the extent report. And I see a willingness for the community to come together and work towards producing potentially more information. Will it be enough to satisfy the minister? I don't know, but I believe it's worth allowing some extra time for this to be explored. And in closing, I just wanted to say that with the Municipal Association of Victoria back in May at the State Council meeting, we, Burundara Council, did put in a motion that was supported almost unanimously by all councils in attendance as a resolution to go to the office of Mr Wynne and seek a review of the practice note 1 to explore options of preserving properties that might be deemed of contributory value, whether they be of an individual or potentially in smaller intact clusters. So we are doing a lot of advocacy, but I believe more can be done, and I would appreciate some extra time to help support the residents to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Goltz.
Thank you, Chair. Look, there's been fantastic amounts of information presented this evening, and I thank Mr. Costello and Ms. Softly for answering a lot of questions in quite a bit of detail. But I'd have to say there are 3 areas still bothering me generally. I recognise a lot of the arguments circulate around tonight, there being 3 reports on this street. The first report was by the first consultant, but the second was a review of the first report by the first consultant. And if I can hark back to an earlier meeting tonight where we talked about Berkeley, it was clearly said the first consultant is very unlikely to recommend changes to their own report. The third report, which we've had represented in quite a bit of detail tonight, and I've got no doubt it was by and large independent, but the word peer review was dropped, the words peer review were dropped in there as well. And I have authorised in my professional career many review reports before, and when we tend to use the word peer review, it tends to change the governance structure of how reports are done. It's more of a cooperative effort between the secondary consultant and the primary consultant. It changes that relationship. So my feeling, and I don't feel 100% satisfied that we've had an independent look at this. The second area of concern which I have is we've talked, a lot of people have raised the issue of part consideration of the street. And one of the big problems I see is I don't think that consideration of that was built in, and I could be correct as incorrect on this, but the consideration that wasn't built into the original brief for these reports. Because I've heard arguments that said we were asked to look at the whole street. Residents wanted us to look at the whole street. So this is too small a part. And I just feel that had it been built into the early brief, we could have looked at it anyway. And I extend that argument further by saying we're letting the shape of the streets determine decisions. If you travel north of Munro Street, which, much of one side of it is included in the original Brickfields recommendation, and you get to the area at the west end of Rosebery, to the right, you have 3 houses in a row that are contributory. To the left, all the houses on that side of the street are contributory. When you then move to the other side of the road, all but a pair are contributory. So, you don't actually have to consider it as part of Rosebery. It's almost a logical extension of the block of contributory properties running up Monroe. And I just believe if that had been considered as an option and in the original brief, it would be considered in more detail. My final concern is that I've heard a number of questions raised tonight, which I'm not convinced have been fully addressed within the reports. And also I've seen some of these questions popping up in the reports themselves. There were some questions I saw about a second entry. Did it exist? Not enough proof. We couldn't find enough connection with the original brickworks, etc., etc. Well, but there's been quite a bit of evidence or social evidence put forward tonight to say there has been another entrance. The evidence of that entrance still exists. And
Need you to wrap up, Councillor.
Really?
Yep, you're just hitting 4 minutes.
So were most of the other councillors, with due respect?
No, actually they weren't.
All right. The entry point, we've heard mentions of certain Holtz and Fritz actually owning properties. And there was living history presented to us tonight about connections with the brickwork owners. I think these questions have to be sorted out before we move forward. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. That takes me to Councillor Addis, followed by Councillor Stavru and then the Mayor. And rest assured, I have got the clock on all of you. Yeah.
That'll be a challenge for me because I speak slowly. So look, I'd like to also thank officers for the work they've done. And I suppose I want to start by reminding everyone that Burundara does have a strong commitment to heritage. Our gap study work is proof of that. It's been a municipal-wide attempt to protect as much heritage as we possibly can. And likewise, a number of us are passionate about our own heritage houses and have over the years before Life on Council worked to protect heritage. So in opposing this motion, it's not about opposing heritage, it's about protecting the process. And I'm concerned that this motion represents a corruption of the proper process. Now, when we apply a heritage overlay, it's really hard work and it's really stressful for residents, officers and councillors. And all of us often face competing views, both for and against. People are often very passionate, very upset. And I think probably, well, certainly for me, I'll speak for me, I find the only way I can sleep at night with all this competing angst is to apply a really sound process. And that process involves relying on expert advice, on seeking qualified experts to guide us in this position. And yes, sometimes we get opposing views and that can be complicated. But I think in this case, what we're being told by several experts is that this precinct just does not reach the threshold for protection. It's not like there are conflicting views. So we're being asked to abandon the standard process, and yet there have been 3 opportunities for this little precinct, this little street, to gain protection. We've had the initial gap study, and that gave people many, many opportunities to present, to argue for the heritage of their street. And like we've heard, no one did. And maybe they didn't know about it, but no one did. We've had the context further report, again saying, no, it doesn't qualify. And then we've had the extent report similarly saying it doesn't qualify. They all found that the threshold hadn't been reached. It wasn't reached in terms of joining it on to the adjacent precinct. It wasn't reached as a standalone street, and it wasn't reached as a section of this street. And we've clearly heard that consideration was given to little sections, but it didn't reach the threshold. So when we make these difficult decisions, we actually have a duty to our whole community, and they rely on us to present a really balanced and impartial way of looking at these things. We need
So I need you to start to wrap up, please.
Yep. And the way we apply an impartial approach is by following the expert advice. And the expert advice has said that there isn't a basis for heritage protection, and I think we should respect the expert advice. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Chair. I certainly wholeheartedly endorse the views by Councillor Addis. Look, I too see the passion in the community, and I feel for them because people get attached to the community, and that's fair enough, and the houses thereby. But a couple of things that sort of form my opinion tonight, and listening to the very expert opinion of Ms. Softly and obviously Mr. Costello. So things that sprung to mind to me were that the built form must in and of itself tell the story intact, and it's, you know, heritage is not a block for demolition. We shouldn't view it that way. We must have some integrity in the process, and furthermore, the story was told very well in that area by other more intact properties, and that's a key thing. The other thing is that too much change has occurred in the said properties already. And to me, that would indicate that if the properties that are going to contribute have already been changed so much, then obviously the community has moved on a little bit. So we have to respect that, and trying to retro sort of respectively say that it has to be frozen in time now may not be the right thing to do. I did speak about a blue collar story because that was the impression when I drove down the street. But I asked, and the response was a very good response, that really the story is not told by the built form. It may be associated into the social history. Of course, every street in Melbourne has got a social history. People have lived there. People have raised families there. But that's not what it is about. It's about the built form telling the story. And the final thing, I guess, that I'm concerned is that, you know, commissioning another report, that to me sort of feels that, you know, this could always be done again and again. And I don't feel right that this is the right thing, particularly since we've asked so many questions. The responses were exceptionally clear and very well formed. And really, in a very lay term, if there was a boundary, this precinct or parts thereof appear to be so far away, I find that it may be so difficult to get a different outcome. And on the basis of that, even though I feel for the community, I also feel for the ward councillors, I can't support this motion in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson. And he'll be followed by Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Councillor Park, through you. I'd like to obviously just start by thanking our residents for, you know, putting up a good case for the protection of this street. And I'd also like to thank our guest presenter this evening, or to answer questions, Ms. Softly, with regards to her report. I think the things that resonate with me, there are a couple of questions that I asked and the answers that were given to me. One was from Ms. Softly with regards to precincts can be small, but they need to be of high quality and very unique to get that benchmark. So whether you're looking at a low, medium or high precinct number of properties that are contributory, it comes down to what those contributory properties are like. And Councillor Stavrey touched on that. The representativeness of the area that it's in, the intrusiveness of any extension. So it's not just a numbers game. There's a lot more metrics that are going on, and it's probably more art than it is actually science in some respects. And that's where it all starts to fall apart, because where we are, councillors, in the absence of any heritage consultant supporting any part of Rosebery Street is we're not going to make it past the starting gate. If we can't actually get to start the process of putting in an amendment because the minister won't accept it because there's no heritage advice supporting our position, we're failing in our duties. So the only way to overcome that is obviously for us to go and get a completely different independent heritage consultant who's going to align their views with where council aligns. And that means we're sort of shopping for a heritage consultant that takes on our views. And I don't think that's appropriate either. So I can't support this. I certainly know the endeavours of the council are moving this. They are honourable. They are to give the community a voice and to, all going well, save some of the heritage properties in the long term. I'm not sure we're able to do that in this instance. I would commend our residents, but I think where our residents need to maybe hone some of their heritage advice is actually through a heritage consultant, so that, putting a case forward, it's got bones on it, so that the two heritage consultants can talk to the bones of it. And it's not to say that that time still may not come, that even if this motion fails tonight, the community still has the opportunity to put some bones on the heritage things that provide new information that we can consider at a later point in time. But unfortunately tonight, I haven't seen any of that, and it's been responded well by our officers and by our heritage consultants. So unfortunately, councillors, and to the mover of the motion, I can't support this one. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Franco.
Thank you. On balance, I've decided to support Councillor Gillies and the motion she has put forward, and I thank her for bringing that motion forward. I also thank all the residents who've presented, whether for or against, and who've participated in this process, which has been quite lengthy. I do know the area well. I lived nearby in a street adjacent to Fritz Holster when I first moved to Burundara, and I would take my kids to Fritz Holster every day when they were young to play for a couple of years. So I do know the streets, I do know the environment around, and I recognise the value judgments that are involved in making a determination. They're not black or white or as numerical as we sometimes would like. And I'd like to point out a couple of points and reservations that I have. Firstly, I do think that Councillor Thompson, our Mayor, has made some very, very good points, as has Councillor Addis, even though they're voting the other way to what how I'm proposing to vote. I do think there is a real issue that if we do put a position forward, it will be knocked back by the independent panel. And I am wary about the decision that we're setting up. And I do think it's incumbent to get additional advice in that regard, whether it's brought forward by residents, because otherwise I suspect it will fail. So we're opening up an opportunity, and even if the motion fails, I think that opportunity is still there. I think Councillor Thompson's made that point. So we're not actually that far apart, and there's still an opportunity to get an outcome either way, but it will be difficult either way. And I do think that work will need to be done if this is to succeed. If it is to succeed, I think it only relates to the Western Precinct. And I think Councillor Galt made an exceptionally important point about the nature of the brief. If the brief had been prepared in such a way that we were only looking at the Western Precinct, and it were taken in that context, in its surrounds, it would be potentially a very different outcome given the value judgments involved. So I don't think in that sense it's so much shopping around for a different consultant. And that's not what Councillor Galt was saying. Councillor Galt was making a very, very significant point. If the brief were written differently, a very different outcome could have been achieved. And I think it's incumbent on us as a council to guide the creation of the brief, even if residents say, you know, look at the whole street. If we'd said, look, we're going to do a different brief and we're going to go out for a Western Precinct, it potentially would have gotten us a better outcome. And I think it's often incumbent on us to do that. I'll just give a comparative example. If a resident came up and said, I've got a speeding problem in my street, can I have 3 speed humps in this location? And we just engage a consultant to look at that proposal put forward by the residents and then strike it out and say, well, look, that didn't work. But if we'd said, look, we've got an issue here, let's get a consultant to give us the right outcome or to look at different, we potentially get a very different outcome. And that's incumbent upon us.
To wrap up.
Thank you. So look, on balance, I'm going to support Councillor Gillies, and thank you for that.
Thank you. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for my voice. I'm with laryngitis tonight, so I'll keep my comments brief and hope that I can contribute to the debate. The stories that we've heard of social history tonight have warmed my heart, and I'm sure warmed your hearts. And it's these lovely little cottages that bring so much value to our community in the aesthetics and in those stories that you can have over a cup of tea. If these lovely little cottages are demolished, the stories too will rapidly fade. And once they're gone, they're gone. I understand that in general terms, the precinct ought to be intact and it ought to be of a certain size. However, I do think that it's worth fighting for each and every one of these little cottages. And if I recall correctly, Heritage Overlay 277 in Bradford Avenue in Kew, I think we ended up protecting 7 homes out of 20 that we initially sought. And it wasn't an intact precinct at all, and nor were they a run of the same vintage homes. But we lost some and we saved some. And I do think that the exercise is worth going through. I don't think that we're giving the residents of Rosebery Street and the surrounds false hope by doing that. And I don't think that it's causing any huge imposition on anyone or the council budget to delay this decision so that we have confidence that we have all of the information at hand and that all of these stories that have been gathered over cups of tea can be documented and put together so that the officers can provide us with their best advice. We're blessed with knowledge and intellect and intelligence, educated, committed community members who have brought this to us, and I thank them for that. Because without them, some of these little nooks and crannies of our community wouldn't come to light. And I accept Mr. Costello's advice and technical assessment but what officers, I'm not being critical of Mr. Costello here, but what officers are not able to take into as much consideration as us as councillors can is the value of the human or avian community and bringing us those stories. That's not to say that the technical advice doesn't get listened to. Absolutely it does, but it's in context, and much criticism has been made of the Andrews government in recent times for relying heavily on advice only and not taking the advice and putting it into context and making a decision on that. So I don't plan to fall foul of the same criticism. So what we hear from our community as councillors must also be taken into consideration. So I'm not disheartened by the advice we've received tonight. In fact, I'm quite encouraged by it, and I think that it's absolutely worth trying to fight harder to protect some little smaller precincts, if that's possible, or extend the existing precinct. And the Burundara Community Plan 2017 and 2021 refresh has told us by so many in our community that heritage is of utmost importance to them. So I encourage you to support the motion put forward tonight by Councillor Gillies, because delaying the decision and gathering as much information as we can and gaining the trust of...
I think you're wrapping up, but I need you to, please.
...is incredibly important. So without hesitation, I will be supporting Councillor Gillies' motion tonight and encourage you to also. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I don't often speak from the chair, but I will on this motion, just so that my position is clear. I'm going to support the motion, but I do so with enormous reluctance. I agree pretty much entirely with what Councillor Addis said, and that explains my grave hesitation. I think that inevitably where this will probably land is that no action will ultimately be taken. This motion will see it come back to us in December, and it will take, clearly it will take a properly prepared professional report that's compelling for us to act on, and quite frankly, based on the advice that we've seen to date, I think that's probably unlikely to be obtained. And those in the community who are keen to see this progress need to understand that it's not a matter of sending multiple emails to councillors or signing petitions. I mean, this is a matter that needs to be addressed and supported by expert evidence, and absent that, it's not going to end the way that you would like. I also take particular note of the fact that the community is far from unanimous, and I noted, for example, the observations by Mr. Eubergang, and again, some of what he said certainly struck me as meritorious. So I support the motion, but by the most narrow margin imaginable, and absent some serious work over the next 8 weeks, I think that inevitably this won't go any further. And again, I'd stress it's not about emails or petitions. It's about actually getting out there and providing cold hard evidence upon which we can take this further. And it seems to me that the buck now stops with the proponents of this, because I don't think the ratepayers need to be burdened with the cost of commissioning another report. But in any event, I'll support this motion tonight. And Councillor Bigger, I think it's your turn.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm very conscious that our residents, with their great stick-to-itiveness, may be running out of steam as we all head quickly towards 10 p.m. But I think it's an interesting coincidence that tonight was the night we adopted the heritage citation for 57 Barclay. And it was to some extent the stick-to-itiveness of members of the community who saw the value in a beautiful and really majestic 100-year-old property, and they fought for it. And over a number of years with that property, that property had been seen in different lights by different assessors. To me, it demonstrates at the very least that independent assessors can differ on heritage assessments. Experts can differ in their views, and it's possible that that could be the same here. As Councillor Galt has noted, the reports that were commissioned were not fully independent of each other, which is not necessarily to criticize them, but to make a statement of fact. And he's raised questions, I guess, about the scope of the brief, which are fair questions. And I guess to ask the question whether those reports really address the concerns fully about the integrity of the street, the history, and the social connection. We know that that the report on Rosebery Street, it confirms that there are 53 heritage homes on this petite little street. As Mr. Simcox noted, this was a blue-collar street. They are workers' cottages. They're not of the same stature as 57 Barclay, but that's not the point here. It's not about saving. I mean, heritage is not about saving big, majestic houses and letting workers' cottages be demolished because they're small or because they belong to less influential people. Having walked along this street many times in the past, I'm unwilling to close the door on this street and its history and just let it evaporate. But I think it's really important to say that we're not voting on a motion tonight to adopt a citation or even pursue that. We're just asking for time to ensure that we've got this right. And for once, we're not pressed for time. We're under no pressure to decide tonight, which is a nice change. And I would say that it's not just about time to no end or just to explore the social history, which might be interesting but not of consequence. Or I would agree with Councillor Addis that we need to seek and we need to listen to expert advice. I mean, I would disagree that to consider further advice or discussion would be a corruption of the process, because this is not the first circumstance where we have gone back for further reports, as we noted with 57 Barclay. And why in that circumstance? Because the community felt the key elements of the home had been missed. So this is in part to engage with the community, yes, to consider whether 53 heritage homes cannot and should not be protected. I think our community has asked us, as Councillor Sinfield said in her croaky voice, they've asked us many times to save their history, their heritage, and their beloved architecture. So I would ask my colleagues to support a deferral on Rosebery Street, and I will be tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. That takes us back to you for your right of reply.
Thank you, Chair. I will be brief. You'll be proud of the crossing outs I've done of the points that have already been made. I thank my colleagues for a robust debate and acknowledge the variety of views expressed. However, and I acknowledge the officer's work. However, our challenge is weighing up technical advice and community expectations. Built form alone can never tell a comprehensive story of any precinct. The residents would love to have been able to put those bones to the case. I thank you, our Mayor. I'd like to provide that opportunity. I believe there is very little to lose and potentially a lot to gain, and I commend the motion to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll put that motion. Those in favour? 1, 2, 3. And those against? That motion is carried. Moving to general business. Are there any items of general business? No. Item 5, urgent business. Item 6, confidential business. No. I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.